Welcome, honored guests of the Rainy Archive. This day we are going to tell the story of Charles Dexter Ward by H.P. Lovecraft. I've been experimenting a little with my style, and whether it strikes your fancy or not, be sure to tell me. Now let us delve in right into that world of horror which H.P. Lovecraft has created for us, and which I will now proceed to unveil. The essential souls of animals may be so prepared and preserved that an ingenious man may have the whole Ark of Noah in his own study, and raise the fine shape of an animal out of its ashes at his pleasure, and by the like method from the essential souls of humane dust, a philosopher may, without any criminal necromancy, call up the shape of any dead ancestor from the dust whereinto his body has been incinerated. Borels. Chapter 1. A Result and a Prologue. 1. From a private hospital for the insane near Providence, Rhode Island, there recently disappeared an exceedingly singular person. He bore the name of Charles Dexter Ward and was placed under restraint most reluctantly by the grieving father, who had watched his aberration grow from a mere eccentricity to a dark mania involving both a possibility of murderous tendencies and a profound and peculiar change in the apparent contents of his mind. Doctors confessed themselves quite baffled by his case, since it presented oddities of a general physiological as well as psychological character. In the first place, the patient seemed oddly older than his 26 years would warrant. Mental disturbance, it is true, will age one rapidly, but the face of this young man had taken on a subtle cast which only the very aged normally acquire. In the second place, his organic processes showed a certain queerness of proportion, which nothing in medical experience can parallel. Respiration and heart action had a baffling lack of symmetry. The voice was lost, so that no sounds above a whisper were possible. Digestion was incredibly prolonged and minimized, and neural reactions to standard stimuli bore no relation at all to anything heretofore recorded, either normal or pathological. The skin had a morbid chill and dryness, and the cellular structure of the tissue seemed exaggeratedly coarse and loosely knit. Even a large olive birthmark on the right hip had disappeared, whilst there had formed on the chest a very peculiar mole or blackish spot, of which no trace existed before. In general, all physicians agree that in Ward, the processes of metabolism had become retarded to a degree beyond precedent. Psychologically too, Charles Ward was unique. His madness held no affinity to any sort recorded in even the latest and most exhaustive of treatises, and was conjoined to a mental force which would have made him a genius or a leader had it not been twisted into strange and grotesque forms. Dr. Willett, who was Ward's family physician, affirms that the patient's gross mental capacity, as gauged by his response to matters outside the sphere of his insanity, had actually increased since the seizure. Ward, it is true, was always a scholar and an antiquarian, but even his most brilliant early work did not show the prodigious grasp and insight displayed during his last examinations by the alienists. It was indeed a difficult matter to obtain a legal commitment to the hospital, so powerful and lucid did the youth's mind seem, and only the evidence of others, and on the strength of many abnormal gaps in his stock of information as distinguished from his intelligence, was he finally placed in confinement. To the very moment of his vanishment, he was an omnivorous reader, and as great a conversationalist as his poor voice permitted, and shrewd observers, failing to foresee his escape, freely predicted that he would not be long in gaining his discharge from custody. Only Dr. Willett, who brought Charles Ward into the world and had watched his growth of body and mind ever since, seemed frightened at the thought of his future freedom. He had had a terrible experience and had made a terrible discovery, which he dared not reveal to his skeptical colleagues. Willett indeed presents a minor mystery all his own in his connection with the case. He was the last to see the patient before his flight, and emerged from that final conversation in a state of mixed horror and relief, which several recalled when Ward's escape became known 3 hours later. That escape itself is one of the unsolved wonders of Dr. Waite's hospital. A window open above a sheer drop of 60 feet could hardly explain it. Yet after that talk with Willett, the youth was undeniably gone. Willett himself has no public explanations to offer, though he seems strangely easier in mind than before the escape. Many indeed feel that he would like to say more if he thought any considerable number would believe him. He had found Ward in his room, but shortly after his departure, the attendants knocked in vain. When they opened the door, the patient was not there, and all they found was the open window with a chill April breeze flowing in a cloud of fine, bluish-grey dust that almost choked them. True, the dogs howled some time before, but that was while Willett was still present, and they had caught nothing and showed no disturbance later on. Ward's father was told at once over the telephone, but he seemed more saddened than surprised. By the time Dr. Waite called in person, Dr. Willett had been talking with him, and both disavowed any knowledge or complicity in the escape. Only from certain closely confidential friends of Willett and the senior ward have any clues been gained, and even these are too wildly fantastic for general credence. The one fact which remains is that up to the present time, no trace of the missing madman has been unearthed. Charles Ward was an antiquarian from infancy, no doubt gaining his taste from the venerable town around him, and from the relics of the past which filled every corner of his parents' old mansion in Prospect Street on the crest of the hill. With the years his devotion to ancient things increased, so that history, genealogy and the study of colonial architecture, furniture and craftsmanship at length crowded everything else from his sphere of interests. These tastes are important to remember in considering his madness, for although they do not form its absolute nucleus, they play a prominent part in its superficial form. The gaps of information which the alienists noticed were all related to modern matters, and were invariably offset by a correspondingly excessive though outwardly concealed knowledge of bygone matters, as brought by adroit questioning, so that one would have fancied the patient literally transferred to a former age through some obscure sort of auto-hypnosis. The odd thing was that Ward seemed no longer interested in the antiquities he knew so well. He had, it appears, lost his regard for them through sheer familiarity, and all his final efforts were obviously bent toward mastering those common facts of the modern world which had been so totally and unmistakably expunged from his brain. That this wholesale deletion had occurred, he did his best to hide, but it was clear to all who watched him that his whole program of reading and conversation was determined by a frantic wish to imbibe such knowledge of his own life and of the ordinary practical and cultural background of the 20th century as ought to have been his by virtue of his birth in 1902 and his education in the schools of our own time. Alienists are now wondering how, in view of his vitally impaired range of data, the escaped patient manages to cope with the complicated world of today, the dominant opinion being that he is lying low in some humble and unexciting position till his stock of modern information can be brought up to the normal. The beginning of Ward's madness is a matter of dispute among alienists. Dr. Lyman, the eminent Boston authority, places it in 1919 or 1920, during the boy's last year at the Moses Brown School, when he suddenly turned from the study of the past to the study of the occult, and refused to qualify for college on the ground that he had individual researches of much greater importance to make. This is certainly borne out by Ward's altered habits at the time, especially by his continual search through town records and among all burying grounds for a certain grave dug in 1771, the grave of an ancestor named Joseph Cohen, some of whose papers he professed to have found behind the paneling of a very old house in Olney Court, on Stamper's Hill, which Cohen was known to have built and occupied. It is, broadly speaking, undeniable that the winter of 1919-20 saw a great change in Ward, whereby he abruptly stopped his general antiquarian pursuits and embarked on a desperate delving into occult subjects, both at home and abroad, varied only by this strangely persistent search for his forefather's grave. From this opinion, however, Dr. Willett substantially dissents, basing his verdict on his close and continuous knowledge of the patient, and on certain frightful investigations and discoveries which he made toward the last. Those investigations and discoveries have left their mark upon him, so that his voice trembles when he tells them, and his hand trembles when he tries to write of them. Willett admits that the change of 1919-20 would originally appear to mark the beginning of a progressive decadence, which culminated in the horrible and uncanny alienation of 1928, but believes, from personal observation, that a finer distinction must be made. Granting freely that the boy was always ill-balanced temperamentally, and prone to be unduly susceptible and enthusiastic in his responses to phenomena around him, he refuses to concede that the early alternation marked the actual passage from sanity to madness, crediting instead Ward's own statement that he had discovered or rediscovered something whose effect on human thought was likely to be marvelous and profound. The true madness, he is certain, came with a later change, after the Cohen portrait and the ancient papers had been unearthed, after a trip to strange foreign places had been made, and some terrible invocations chanted under strange and secret circumstances, after certain answers to these invocations had been plainly indicated, and a frantic letter penned under agonizing and inexplicable conditions, after the wave of vampirism and the ominous Pautaxet gossip, and after the patient's memory commenced to exclude contemporary images, whilst his voice failed, and his physical aspect underwent the subtle modifications so many subsequently noticed. It was only about this time Willett points out with much acuteness that the nightmare qualities became indubitably linked with Ward, and the doctor feels shudderingly sure that enough solid evidence exists to sustain the youth's claim regarding his crucial discovery. In the first place, two workmen of high intelligence saw Joseph Cohen's ancient papers found. Secondly, the boy once showed Dr. Willett those papers and a page of the Cohen diary, and each of the documents had every appearance of genuineness. The hole where Ward claimed to have found them was long a visible reality, and Willett had a very convincing final glimpse of them in surroundings which can scarcely be believed and can never perhaps be proved. Then there were the mysteries and coincidences of the Owen and Hutchinson letters, and the problem of the Cohen penmanship, and of what the detectives brought to light about Dr. Allen. These things and the terrible message in medieval minuscules found in Willett's pocket when he gained consciousness after his shocking experience. And, most conclusive of all, there are two hideous results which the doctor obtained from a certain pair of formulae during his final investigations, results which virtually prove the authenticity of the papers and of their monstrous implications at the same time that those papers were born forever from human knowledge. 2. One must look back at Charles Ward's earlier life, as at something belonging as much to the past as the antiquities he loved so keenly. In the autumn of 1918, and with a considerable show of zest in the military training of the period, he had begun his junior year at the Moses Brown School, which lies very near his home. The old main building, erected in 1819, had always charmed his youthful antiquarian sense, and the spacious park in which the academy is set appealed to his sharp eye for landscape. His social activities were few, and his hours were spent mainly at home, in rambling walks, in his classes and drills, and in pursuit of antiquarian and genealogical data at the City Hall, the State House, the Public Library, the Anaphenium, the Historical Society, the John Carter Brown and the John Hay Libraries of Brown University, and the newly opened Shepley Library in Benefit Street. One may picture him yet as he was in those days, tall, slim, and blond, with studious eyes and a slight stoop, dressed somewhat carelessly, and giving a dominant impression of harmless awkwardness rather than attractiveness. His walks were always adventurous in antiquity, during which he managed to recapture from the myriad relics of a glamorous old city a vivid and connected picture of the centuries before. His home was a great Georgian mansion atop the well-nigh precipitous hill that rises just east of the river, and from the rear windows of its rambling wings he could look dizzily out over all the clustered spires, domes, roofs, and skyscraper summits of the lower town to the purple hills of the countryside beyond. Here he was born, and from the lovely classic porch of the double-bayed brick facade his nurse had first wheeled him in his carriage, past the little white farmhouse of 200 years before that the town had long ago overtaken, and on toward the stately colleges along the shady, sumptuous street, whose old square brick mansions and smaller wooden houses with narrow, heavy-columned Doric porches dreamed solid and exclusive amidst the generous yards and gardens. He had been wheeled, too, along sleepy Condon Street, one tiered lower down on the steep hill, and with all its eastern homes on high terraces. The small wooden houses averaged a greater age here, for it was up this hill that the growing town had climbed, and in these rides he had imbibed something of the color of a quaint colonial village. The nurse used to stop and sit on the benches of Prospect Terrace to chat with policemen, and one of the child's first memories was of the great westward sea of hazy roofs and domes and steeples and far hills, which he saw one winter afternoon from the great railed embankment, all violet and mystic against a fevered, apocalyptic sunset of reds and golds and purples and curious greens. The vast marble dome of the State House stood out in massive silhouette, its crowning statue haloed fantastically by a break in one of the tinted stratus clouds that barred the flaming sky. When he was larger, his famous walks began, first with his impatiently dragged nurse, and then alone in dreamy meditation. Farther and farther down that almost perpendicular hill he would venture, each time reaching older and quainter levels of the ancient city. He would hesitate gingerly down vertical Jenkins Street with its bank walls and colonial gables to the shady Benefit Street corner, where before him was a wooden antique with an Ionic pilastered pair of doorways, and beside him a prehistoric gambrel roofer with a bit of primal farmyard remaining, and a great Judge Darfy house with its fallen vestiges of Georgian grandeur. It was getting to be a slum here, but the Titan elms cast a restoring shadow over the place, and the boy used to stroll south past the long lines of the pre-revolutionary homes with their great central chimneys and classic portals. On the eastern side they were set high over basements, with railed double flights of stone steps, and the young Charles could picture them as they were when the street was new, and red heels and periwigs set off the painted pediments whose signs of wear were now becoming so visible. Westward, the hill dropped almost as steeply as above, down to the old town street that the founders had laid out at the river's edge in 1636. Here ran innumerable little lanes with leaning, huddled houses of immense antiquity, and fascinated though he was, it was long before he dared to fret their archaic verticality for fear they would turn out a dream or a gateway to unknown terrors. He found it much less formidable to continue along Benefit Street past the iron fence of St. John's hidden churchyard and the rear of the 1761 Colony House, and the mouldering bulk of the Golden Bull Inn where Washington stopped. At Meeting Street, the successive Jail Lane and King Street of other periods, he would look upward to the east and see the arced flight of steps to which the highway had to resort in climbing the slope, and downward to the west, glimpsing the old brick colonial schoolhouse that smiles across the road at the ancient sign of Shakespeare's Head, where the Providence Gazette and Country Journal was printed before the Revolution. Then came the exquisite First Baptist Church of 1775, luxurious with its matchless gypsy steeple and the Georgian roofs and cupolas hovering by. Here and to the southward, the neighborhood became better, flowering at last into a marvelous group of early mansions. But still the little ancient lanes led off down the precipice to the west, spectral in their many-gabled archaism and dipping to a riot of iridescent decay, where the wicked old waterfront recalls its proud East India days, amidst polyglot vice and squalor, rotting wharves, and blear-eyed ship chandeliers, with such surviving alley names as Packet, Bullion, Gold, Silver, Coin, Doubloon, Sovereign, Guilder, Dollar, Dime, and Cent. Sometimes, as he grew taller and more adventurous, young Ward would venture down into this maelstrom of tottering houses, broken transoms, tumbling steps, twisted balustrades, swarthy faces, and nameless odors, winding from South Main to South Water, searching out the docks where the bay and sound steamers still touched, and returning northward at this lower level past the steep-roofed 1816 warehouses and the broad square at the Great Bridge, where the 1773 market house still stands firm on its ancient arcs. In that square he would pause to drink in the bewildering beauty of the old town as it rises on its eastward bluff, decked with its two Georgian spires, and crowned by the vast new Christian Science dome as London is crowned by St. Paul's. He liked mostly to reach this point in the late afternoon, when the slanting sunlight touches the market house and the ancient hill roofs and belfries with gold, and throws magic around the dreaming wharves where Providence Indiamen used to ride and anchor. After a long look, he would grow almost dizzy with a poet's love for the sight, and then he would scale the slope homeward in the dusk past the old white church and up the narrow precipitous ways, where yellow gleams would begin to peep out in small paned windows and through fanlights set high over double flights of steps with curious wrought iron railings. At other times, and in later years, he would seek for vivid contrasts, spending half a walk in the crumbling colonial regions northwest of his home, where the hill drops to the lower eminence of Stamper's Hill with its ghetto and Negro quarter clustering round the place where the Boston stagecoach used to start before the Revolution, and the other half in the gracious southerly realm about George, Benevolent Power and Williams streets, where the old slope holds unchanged the fine estates and bits of walled garden and steep green lane in which so many fragrant memories linger. These rambles, together with the diligent studies which accompanied them, certainly account for a large amount of the antiquarian lore which at last crowded the modern world from Charles Ward's mind, and illustrate the mental soil upon which fell in that fateful winter of 1919-20 the seeds that came to such strange and terrible fruition. Dr. Willett is certain that, up to this ill-omened winter of first change, Charles Ward's antiquarianism was free from every trace of the morbid. Graveyards held for him no particular attraction beyond their quaintness and historic value, and of anything like violence or savage instinct he was utterly devoid. Then, by insidious degrees, there appeared to develop a curious sequel to one of his genealogical triumphs of the year before, when he had discovered among his maternal ancestors a certain very long-lived man named Joseph Cohen, who had come from Salem in March of 1692, and about whom a whispered series of highly peculiar and disquieting stories clustered. Ward's great-great-grandfather, Wellcome Potter, had in 1785 married a certain Ann Tillinghast, daughter of Mrs. Eliza, daughter to Captain James Tillinghast, of whose paternity the family had preserved no trace. Late in 1918, whilst examining a volume of original town records and manuscript, the young genealogist encountered an entry describing a legal change of name, by which in 1772 a Mrs. Eliza Cohen, widow of Joseph Cohen, resumed, along with her 7-year-old daughter Anne, her maiden name of Tillinghast, on the ground that her husband's name was become a public reproach by reason of what was known after his decease, the which confirming an ancient common rumour, though not to be credited by a loyal wife till so proven as to be wholly past doubting. This entry came to light upon the accidental separation of two leaves, which had been carefully pasted together, and treated as one by a laboured revision of the page numbers. It was at once clear to Charles Ward that he had indeed discovered a hitherto unknown great-great-great-grandfather. The discovery doubly excited him, because he had already heard vague reports and seen scattered allusions relating to this person, about whom there remained so few publicly available records, aside from those becoming public only in modern times, that it almost seemed as if a conspiracy had existed to blot him from memory. What did appear, moreover, was of such a singular and provocative nature that one could not fail to imagine curiously what was that the colonial recorders were so anxious to conceal and forget, or to suspect that the deletion had reasons all too valid. Before this, Ward had been content to let his romancing about old Joseph Cohen remain in the idle stage, but having discovered his own relationship to this apparently hushed-up character, he proceeded to hunt out as systematically as possible whatever he might find concerning him. In this excited quest, he eventually succeeded beyond his highest expectations, for old letters, diaries, and sheaves of unpublished memoirs in cobwebbed Providence garrets and elsewhere yielded many illuminating passages which the writers had not thought it worth their while to destroy. One important sidelight came from a point as remote as New York, where some Rhode Island colonial correspondence was stored in the museum at France's Tavern. The really crucial thing, though, and what in Dr. Willett's opinion formed the definite source of Ward's undoing, was the matter found in August 1919 behind the panelling of the crumbling house in Olney Court. It was that, beyond a doubt, which opened up those black vistas whose end was deeper than the pit. Chapter 2. An Antecedent and a Horror. 1. Joseph Cohen, as revealed by the rambling legends embodied in what Ward heard and unearthed, was a very astonishing, enigmatic, and obscurely horrible individual. He had fled from Salem to Providence, that universal heaven of the odd, the free, and the dissenting, at the beginning of the great witchcraft panic, being in fear of accusation because of his solitary ways and queer chemical or alchemical experiments. He was a colorless-looking man of about 30, and was soon found qualified to become a freeman of Providence, thereafter buying a home lot just north of Gregory Dexter's at about a foot of Olney Street. His house was built on Stamper's Hill, west of the town street, in what later became Olney Court, and in 1761 he replaced this with a larger one, on the same site, which is still standing. Now the first odd thing about Joseph Cohen was that he did not seem to grow much older than he had been on his arrival. He engaged in shipping enterprises, purchased wharfage near Mile End Cove, helped rebuild the Great Bridge in 1713, and in 1723 was one of the founders of the Congregational Church on the Hill. But always did he retain the nondescript aspect of a man not greatly over 30 or 35. As decades mounted up, this singular quality began to excite wide notice, but Cohen always explained it by saying that he came of hardy forefathers, and practiced a simplicity of living which did not wear him out. How such simplicity could be reconciled with the inexplicable comings and goings of the secretive merchant, and with the queer gleaming of his windows at all hours at night, was not very clear to the townsfolk, and they were prone to assign other reasons for his continued youth and longevity. It was held, for the most part, that Cohen's incessant mixings and boilings of chemicals had much to do with his condition. Gossip spoke of the strange substances he brought from London and the Indies on his ships, or purchased in Newport, Boston, and New York. And when old Dr. Jabez Bowen came from Rehoboth and opened his apothecary shop across the Great Bridge at the sign of the Unicorn and Mortar, there was ceaseless talk of the drugs, acids, and metals that the tacticar and the clues incessantly bought or ordered from him. Acting on the assumption that Cohen possessed a wondrous and secret medical skill, many sufferers of various sorts applied to him for aid. But though he appeared to encourage their belief in a non-committal way, and always gave them odd-colored potions in response to their requests, it was observed that his ministrations to others seldom proved of benefit. At length, when over 50 years had passed since the stranger's advent, and without producing more than 5 years' apparent change in his face and physique, the people began to whisper more darkly, and to meet more than halfway the desire for isolation which he had always shewn. Private letters and diaries of the period reveal, too, a multitude of other reasons why Joseph Cohen was marvelled at, feared, and finally shunned like a plague. His passion for graveyards, in which he was glimpsed at all hours and under all conditions, was notorious, though no one had witnessed any deed on his part which could actually be termed ghoulish. On the Pawtuxet Road he had a farm, at which he generally lived during the summer, and to which he would frequently be seen riding at various odd times of the day and night. Here his only visible servants, farmers and caretakers, were a sullen pair of aged Narragansett Indians, the husband dumb and curiously scared, and the wife of a very repulsive cast of countenance, probably due to a mixture of negro blood. In the lean-to of this house was the laboratory where most of the chemical experiments were conducted. Curious porters and teamers who delivered bottles, bags, or boxes at the small rear door would exchange accounts of the fantastic flasks, crucibles, alembics, and furnaces they saw in the low-shelved room, and prophesied in whispers that the close-mouthed chemist, by which they meant alchemist, would not be long in finding the philosopher's stone. The nearest neighbors to this farm, the Fenners, a quarter of a mile away, had still queerer things to tell of certain sounds which they insisted came from the Cohen place in the night. There were cries, they said, and sustained howlings, and they did not like the large number of livestock which thronged the pastures, for no such amount was needed to keep a lone old man and a very few servants in meat, milk, and wool. The identity of the stock seemed to change from week to week as new droves were purchased from the Kingstown farmers. Then, too, there was something very obnoxious about a certain great stone outbuilding with only high narrow slits for windows. Great Bridge idlers likewise had much to say of Cohen's townhouse in Olnicott. Not so much the fine new one built in 1761, when the man must have been nearly a century old, but the first, low gambrel roofed one, with the windowless attic and shingled sides, whose timbers he took the peculiar precaution of burning after its demolition. Here there was less mystery, it is true, but the hours at which lights were seen, the secretiveness of the two swarthy foreigners who comprised the only menservants, the hideous, indistinct mumbling of the incredibly aged French housekeeper, the large amounts of food seen to enter the door within which only 4 persons lived, and the quality of certain voices often heard in muffled conversation at highly unseasonable times, all combined with what was known of the Pawtuxet farm to give the place a bad name. In choicer circles, too, the Cohen home was by no means undiscussed, for as the newcomer had gradually walked into the church and trading life of the town, He had naturally made acquaintances of the better sort, whose company and conversation he was well fitted by education to enjoy. His birth was known to be good, since the Cohens or Cohens of Salem needed no introduction in New England. It developed that Joseph Cohen had travelled much in very early life, living for a time in England and making at least 2 voyages to the Orient, and his speech, when he deigned to use it, was that of a learned and cultivated Englishman. But for some reason or other, Cohen did not care for society. Whilst never actually rebuffing a visitor, he always reared such a wall of reserve that few could think of anything to say to him which would not sound inane. There seemed to lurk in his bearing some cryptic, sardonic arrogance, as if he had come to find all human beings dull through having moved among stranger and more potent entities. When Dr. Checkley, the famous wit, came from Boston in 1738 to be the rector of King's Church, he did not neglect calling on one of whom he soon heard so much, but left in a very short while because of some sinister undercurrent he detected in his host's discourse. Charles Ward told his father, when they discussed Cohen one winter evening, that he would give much to learn what the mysterious old man had said to the sprightly cleric, but that all diarists agree concerning Dr. Checkley's reluctance to repeat anything he had heard. The good man had been hideously shocked, and could never recall Joseph Cohen without a visible loss of the gay urbanity for which he was famed. More definite, however, was the reason why another man of taste and breeding avoided the haughty hermit. In 1746, Mr. John Merritt, an elderly English gentleman of literary and scientific leanings, came from Newport to the town which was so rapidly overtaking it in standing, and built a fine country seat on the neck in what is now the heart of the best residence section. He lived in considerable style and comfort, keeping the first coach and liveried servants in town, and taking great pride in his telescope, his microscope, and his well-chosen library of English and Latin books. Hearing of Cohen as the owner of the best library in Providence, Mr. Merritt early paid him a call, and was more cordially received than most other callers at the house had been. His admiration for his host's ample shelves, which besides the Greek, Latin and English classics were equipped with a remarkable battery of philosophical, mathematical and scientific works including Paracelsus, Agricola, Van Helmont, Sylvius, Glauber, Boyle, Boerhaave, Becker and Stoll, led Cohen to suggest a visit to the farmhouse and laboratory whither he had never invited anyone before, and the two drove out at once in Mr. Merritt's coach. Mr. Merritt always confessed to seeing nothing really horrible at the farmhouse, but maintained that the titles of the books in the special library of thaumaturgical, alchemical and theological subjects which Cohen kept in a front room were alone sufficient to inspire him with a lasting loathing. Perhaps, however, the facial expression of the owner in exhibiting them contributed much of the prejudice. The bizarre collection, besides a host of standard works which Mr. Merritt was not too alarmed to envy, embraced nearly all the Kabbalists, demonologists and magicians known to man, and was a treasure house of lore in the doubtful realms of alchemy and astrology. Hermes Trismegistus in Mersnad's edition, the Tuba Philosophorum, Geber's Liber Investigationis, and Artephius' Key of Wisdom all were there, with the Kabbalistic Zohar, Peter Jemmy's set of Albertus Magnus, Raymond Lully's Ars Magna et Ultima in Zetzner's edition, Roger Bacon's Thesaurus Chemicus, Flad's Clavis Alchemiae, and Trithemius de Lapide Philosophico crowding them close. Medieval Jews and Arabs were represented in profusion, and Mr. Merritt turned pale when upon taking down a fine volume conspicuously labelled as Quanon e Islam, he found it was in truth the forbidden Necronomicon of the mad Arab Abdul Ahazrid, of which he had heard such monstrous things whispered some years previously after the exposure of nameless rites at the strange little fishing village of Kingsport, in the province of the Massachusetts Bay. But oddly enough, the worthy gentleman owned himself most impalpably disquieted by a mere minor detail. On the huge mahogany table there lay face downward a badly worn copy of Borell's, bearing many cryptical marginalia and interlineations in Cohen's hand. The book was open at about its middle, and one paragraph displayed such thick and tremulous penstrokes beneath the lines of mystic black letter that the visitor could not resist scanning it through. Whether it was the nature of the passage underscored, or the feverish heaviness of the strokes which formed the underscoring, he could not tell, but something in that combination affected him very badly and very peculiarly. He recalled it to the end of his days, writing it down from memory in his diary, and once trying to recite it to his close friend Dr. Checkley, till he saw how greatly it disturbed the urbane lector. It read, "The essential souls of animals may be so prepared and preserved that an ingenious man may have the whole ark of Noah in his own study, and raise the fine shape of an animal out of its ashes at his pleasure. And by the like method from the essential souls of humane dust, a philosopher may, without any criminal necromancy, call up the shape of any dead ancestor from whom the dust whereinto his body has been incinerated." It was near the docks, along the southerly part of the town street, however, that the worst things were muttered about Joseph Cohen. Sailors are superstitious folk, and the seasoned souls who manned the infinite rum, slave, and molasses sloops, the rakish privateers, and the great brigs of the Browns, Crawfords, and Tillingasts, all made strange furtive signs of protection when they saw the slim, deceptively young-looking figure with its yellow hair and slight stoop entering the Cohen warehouse in Dublin Street, or talking with captains and supercargoes on the long quay where the Cohen ships rode restlessly. Cohen's own clerks and captains hated and feared him, and all his sailors were mongrel riffraff from Martinique, St. Eustatius, Havana, or Port Royal. It was, in a way, the frequency with which these sailors were replaced which inspired the acutest and most tangible part of the fear in which the old man was held. A crew would be turned loose in the town on shore leave, some of its members perhaps charged with this errand or that, and when reassembled, it would be almost sure to lack one or more men. That many of the errands had concerned the farm on the Pawtuxet Road, and that few of the sailors had ever been seen to return from that place, was not forgotten, so that in time it became exceedingly difficult for Cohen to keep his oddly assorted hands. Almost invariably several would desert soon after hearing the gossip of the Providence wharves, and the replacement in the West Indies became an increasingly great problem to the merchant. In 1760, Joseph Cohen was virtually an outcast, suspected of vague horrors and demoniac alliances which seemed all the more menacing because they could not be named, understood, or even proved to exist. The last straw may have come from the affair of the missing soldiers in 1758, for in March and April of that year, 2 royal regiments on their way to New France were quartered in Providence, and depleted by an inexplicable process far beyond the average rate of desertion. Rumour dwelt on the frequency with which Cohen was wont to be seen talking with the red-coated strangers, and as several of them began to be missed, people thought of the odd conditions among his own seamen. What would have happened if the regiments had not been ordered on? No one can tell. Meanwhile, the merchant's worldly affairs were prospering. He had the virtual monopoly of the town's trade in saltpeter, black pepper, and cinnamon, and easily led any other one shipping establishment save the Browns in his importation of brassware, indigo, cotton, woolens, salt, rigging, iron, paper, and English goods of every kind. Such shopkeepers as James Green at the sign of Elephant in Cheapside, the Russells at the sign of the Golden Eagle across the bridge, or clerk and nightingale at the frying pan and fish near the new coffee house, depended almost wholly upon him for their stock, and his arrangements with the local distillers, the Narragansett dairymen and horse breeders, and the Newport candlemakers, made him one of the prime exporters of the colony. Ostracized though he was, he did not lack for civic spirit of a sort. When the colony house burned down, he subscribed handsomely to the lotteries by which the new brick one, still standing at the head of its parade in the old main street, was built in 1761. In that same year, too, he helped rebuild the great bridge after the October gale. He replaced many of the books of the public library consumed in the colony house fire and bought heavily in the lottery that gave the muddy market parade and deep-rutted town street their pavement of great round stones with a brick footwork or cozy in the middle. About this time also he built the plain but excellent new house, whose doorway is still such a triumph of carving. When the Whitefield adherents broke off from Dr. Cotton's Hill Church in 1743 and founded Deacon Snow's church across the bridge, Cohen had gone with them, though his zeal and attendance soon abated. Now, however, he cultivated piety once more, as if to dispel the shadow which had thrown him into isolation and would soon begin to wreck his business fortunes, if not sharply checked. 2. The sight of the strange, pallid man, hardly middle-aged in aspect, yet certainly not less than a full century old, seeking at last to emerge from a cloud of fright and detestation too vague to pin down or analyze, was at once a pathetic, a dramatic, and a contemptible thing. Such is the power of wealth and of surface gestures, however, that there came indeed a slight abatement in the visible aversion displayed toward him, especially after the rapid disappearances of his sailors abruptly ceased. He must likewise have begun to practice an extreme care and secrecy in his graveyard expeditions, for he was never again caught at such wanderings, whilst the rumours of uncanny sounds and manoeuvres at his Pawtuxet farm diminished in proportion. His rate of food consumption and cattle replacement remained abnormally high, but not until modern times, when Charles Ward examined a set of his accounts and invoices in the Shepley Library, did occur to any person, save one embittered youth perhaps, to make dark comparisons between the large number of Guinea Black Sea imported until 1766 and the disturbingly small number for whom he could produce bona fide bills of sale either to slave dealers at the Great Bridge or to the planters of the Narragansett country. Certainly, the cunning and ingenuity of this abhorred character were uncannily profound, once the necessity for their exercise had become impressed upon him. But, of course, the effect of all this belated mending was necessarily slight. Cohen continued to be avoided and distrusted, as indeed the one fact of his continued air of youth at a great age would have been enough to warrant. And he could see that in the end his fortunes would be likely to suffer. His elaborate studies and experiments, whatever they may have been, apparently required a heavy income for their maintenance, and since a change of environment would deprive him of the trading advantages he had gained, it would not have profited him to begin anew in a different region just then. Judgment demanded that he patch up his relations with the townsfolk of Providence, so that his presence might no longer be a signal for hushed conversation, transparent excuses of errands elsewhere, and a general atmosphere of constraint and uneasiness. His clerks, being now reduced to the shiftless and impetuous residue whom no one else would employ, were giving him much worry, and he held to his sea captains and mates only by shrewdness in gaining some kind of ascendancy over them. A mortgage, a promissory note, or a bit of information very pertinent to their welfare. In many cases, diarists have recorded with some awe Cohen showed almost the power of a wizard in unearthing family secrets for questionable use. During the final 5 years of his life, it seemed as though only direct talks with the long dead could possibly have furnished some of the data which he had so glibly at his tongue's end. About this time, the crafty scholar hit upon a last desperate expedient to regain his footing in the community. It had to a complete hermit. He now determined to contract an advantageous marriage, securing as a bride some lady whose unquestioned position would make all ostracism of his home impossible. It may be that he also had deeper reasons for wishing an alliance. Reasons so far outside the known cosmic sphere that only papers found a century and a half after his death caused anyone to suspect them. But of this nothing certain can ever be learned. Naturally, he was aware of the horror and indignation with which any ordinary courtship of his would be received. Hence he looked about for some likely candidate upon whose parents he might exert a suitable pressure. Such candidates, he found, were not at all easy to discover, since he had very particular requirements in the way of beauty, accomplishments, and social security. At length his survey narrowed down to the household of one of his best and oldest ship captains, a widower of high birth and unblemished standing named Duty Tillinghast, whose only daughter Eliza seemed dowered with every conceivable advantage save prospects as a heiress. Captain Tillinghast was completely under the domination of Cohen, and consented, after a terrible interview in his cupulate house on Powerless Lane Hill, to sanction the blasphemous alliance. Eliza Tillinghast was at that time 18 years of age, and had been reared as gently as the reduced circumstances of her father permitted. She had attended Stephen Jackson's school opposite the courthouse parade, and had been diligently instructed by her mother, before the latter's death of smallpox in 1757, in all the arts and refinements of domestic life. A sampler of hers, worked in 1753 at the age of 9, may still be found in the rooms of Rhode Island Historical Society. After her mother's death, she had kept the house, aided only by one old black woman. Her arguments with her father concerning the proposed Cohen marriage must have been painful indeed, but of these we have no record. Certain it is that her engagement to young Ezra Whedon, second mate of the Crawford Packet Enterprise, was dutifully broken off, and that her union with Joseph Cohen took place on the 7th of March, 1763, in the Baptist Church, in the presence of one of the most distinguished assemblages which the town could boast, the ceremony being performed by the younger Samuel Windsor. The Gazette mentioned the event very briefly, and in most surviving copies the item in question seems to be cut or torn out. Ward found a single intact copy after much search in the archives of a private collector of note, observing with amusement the meaningless urbanity of the language. Monday evening last, Mr. Joseph Cohen of this town, merchant, was married to Miss Eliza Tillinghast, daughter of Captain U.T. Tillinghast, a young lady who has real merit, added to a beautiful person, to grace the connubial state and perpetuate its felicity. The collection of Darby Arnold letters, discovered by Charles Ward shortly before his first reputed madness in the private collection of Melville F. Peters, Esquire of George Street, and covering this and a somewhat antecedent period, throws vivid light on the outrage done to public sentiment by this ill-assorted match. The social influence of the Tillinghasts, however, was not to be denied, and once more Joseph Cohen found his house frequented by persons whom he could never otherwise have induced to cross his threshold. His acceptance was by no means complete, and his bride was socially the sufferer through her forced venture. But at all events, the wall of utter ostracism was somewhat worn down. In his treatment of his wife, the strange bridegroom astonished both her and the community by displaying an extreme graciousness and consideration. The new house in Olney Court was now wholly free from disturbing manifestations, and although Cohen was much absent at the Pawtuxet farm which his wife never visited, he seemed more like a normal citizen than at any other time in his long years of residence. Only one person remained in open enmity with him, this being the youthful ship's officer whose engagement to Eliza Tillinghast had been so abruptly broken. Ezra Whedon had frankly vowed vengeance, and though of a quiet and ordinarily mild disposition, was now gaining a hate-bred, dogged purpose which boded no good to the usurping husband. On the 7th of May, 1765, Cohen's only child Anne was born, and was christened by the Reverend John Graves of King's Church, of which both husband and wife had become communicants shortly after the marriage, in order to compromise between their respective Congregational and Baptist affiliations. The record of this birth, as well as that of the marriage 2 years before, was stricken from most copies of the church and town annals where it ought to appear, and Charles Ward located both with the greatest difficulty after his discovery of the widow's change of name had apprised him of his own relationship, and engendered the feverish interest which culminated in his madness. The birth entry, indeed, was found very curiously through correspondence with the heirs of the loyalist Dr. Graves, who had taken with him a duplicate set of records when he left his pastorate at the outbreak of the Revolution. Ward had tried this source because he knew that his great-great-grandmother Anne Tillinghast Potter had been an Episcopalian. Shortly after the birth of his daughter, an event he seemed to welcome with a fervour greatly out of keeping with his usual coldness, Cohen resolved to sit for a portrait. This he had painted by a very gifted Scotsman named Cosmo Alexander, then a resident of Newport, and since famous as the early teacher of Gilbert Stroud. The likeness was said to have been executed on a wall panel of the library of the house in Olney Court, but neither of the two old diaries mentioning it gave any hint of its ultimate disposition. At this period, the erratic scholar showed signs of unusual abstraction, and spent as much time as he possibly could at his farm on the Pawtuxet Road. He seemed, it was stated, in a condition of suppressed excitement or suspense, as if expecting some phenomenal thing or on the brink of some strange discovery. Chemistry or alchemy would appear to have played a great part, for he took from his house to the farm the greater number of his volumes on that subject. His affectation of civic interest did not diminish, and he lost no opportunities for helping such leaders as Stephen Hopkins, Joseph Brown and Benjamin West in their efforts to raise a cultural tone of the town, which was then much below the level of Newport in its patronage of the liberal arts. He had helped Daniel Jenkins found his bookshop in 1763 and was thereafter his best customer, extending aid likewise to the struggling gazette that appeared each Wednesday at the sign of Shakespeare's Head. In politics, he ardently supported Governor Hopkins against the Ward party whose prime strength was in Newport, and his really eloquent speech at Hacker's Hall in 1765 against the setting off of North Providence as a separate town with a pro-Ward vote in the General Assembly did more than any other one thing to wear down the prejudice against him. But Ezra Whedon, who watched him closely, sneered cynically at all this outward activity, and freely swore it was no more than a mask for some nameless traffic with the blackest gulfs of Tartarus. The revengeful youth began a systematic study of the man and his doings whenever he was in port, spending hours at night by the wharves with a dory in readiness when he saw lights in the Cohen warehouses, and following the small boat which would sometimes steal quietly off and down the bay. He also kept as close a watch as possible on the Pawtuxet farm, and was once severely bitten by the dogs the old Indian couple loosed upon him. 3. In 1766 came the final change in Joseph Cohen. It was very sudden, and gained wide notice amongst the curious townsfolk, for the air of suspense and expectancy dropped like an old cloak, giving instant place to an ill-concealed exultation of perfect triumph. Cohen seemed to have difficulty in restraining himself from public harangues on what he had found or learned or made, but apparently the need of secrecy was greater than the longing to share his rejoicing, for no explanation was ever offered by him. It was after this transition, which appears to have come early in July, that the sinister scholar began to astonish people by his possession of information which only their long-dead ancestors would seem to be able to impart. But Cohen's feverish secret activities by no means ceased with this change. On the contrary, they tended rather to increase, so that more and more of his shipping business was handled by the captains whom he now bound to him by ties of fear, as potent as those of bankruptcy had been. He altogether abandoned the slave trade, alleging that its profits were constantly decreasing. Every possible moment was spent at the Pawtuxet farm, though there were rumors now and then of his presence in places which, though not actually near graveyards, were yet so situated in relation to graveyards that thoughtful people wonder just how thorough the old merchant's change of habits really was. Ezra Whedon, though his periods of espionage were necessarily brief and intermittent on account of his sea voyaging, had a vindictive persistence which the bulk of the practical townsfolk and farmers lacked, and subjected Cohen's affairs to a scrutiny such as they had never had before. Many of the odd maneuvers of the strange merchant vessels had been taken for granted on account of the unrest of the times, when every colonist seemed determined to resist the provisions of the Sugar Act, which hampered the prominent traffic. Smuggling and evasion were the rule in Narragansett Bay, and nocturnal landings of illicit cargoes were continuous commonplaces. But Whedon, night after night, following the lighters or small sloops which he saw steal off from the Cohen warehouses and the Town Street docks, soon felt assured that it was not merely His Majesty's armed ships which the sinister skulker was anxious to avoid. Prior to the change in 1766, these boats had for the most part contained chained Negroes, who were carried down and across the bay and landed at an obscure point on the shore just north of Pawtuxet, being afterward driven up the bluff and across country to the Cohen farm, where they were locked in that enormous stone outbuilding which had only high, narrow slits for windows. After that change, however, the whole program was altered. Importation of slaves ceased at once, and for a time Cohen abandoned his midnight sailings. Then, about the spring of 1767, a new policy appeared. Once more the lighters grew wont to put out from the Black Silent docks, and this time they would go down the bay some distance, perhaps as far as Namquit Point, where they would meet and receive cargo from strange ships of considerable size and widely varied appearance. Cohen's sailors would then deposit this cargo at the usual point on the shore and transport it overland to the farm, locking it in the same cryptical stone building which had formerly received the Negroes. The cargo consisted almost wholly of boxes and cases, of which a large proportion were oblong and heavy and disturbingly suggestive of coffins. We then always watched the farm with unremitting assiduity, visiting it each night for long periods, and seldom letting a week go by without a sight except when the ground bore a footprint revealing snow. Even then, he would often walk as close as possible in the travelled road or on the ice of the neighbouring river to see what tracks others might have left. Finding his own vigils interrupted by nautical duties, he hired a tavern companion named Eleazar Smith to continue the survey during his absences, and between them the two could have set in motion some extraordinary rumours. That they did not do so was only because they knew the effect of publicity would be to warn their quarry and make further progress impossible. Instead, they wished to learn something definite before taking any action. What they did learn must have been startling indeed, and Charles Ward spoke many times to his parents of his regret at Whedon's later burning of his notebooks. All that can be told of their discoveries is what Eleazar Smith jotted down in a none-too-coherent diary, and what other diarists and letter writers have timidly repeated from the statements which they finally made, and according to which the farm was only the outer shell of some vast and revolting menace, of a scope and depth too profound and intangible for more than shadowy comprehension. It is gathered that Whedon and Smith became early convinced that a great series of tunnels and catacombs, inhabited by a very sizable staff of persons besides the old Indians and his wife, underlay the farm. The house was an old Peak relic of the middle 17th century, with enormous stuck chimney and diamond-paned lattice windows, the laboratory being in a lean-to toward the north, where the roof came nearly to the ground. This building stood clear of any other, yet judging by the different voices heard at odd times within, it must have been accessible through secret passages beneath. These voices, before 1766, were mere mumblings and negro whisperings and frenzied screams, coupled with curious chants and evocations. After that date, however, they assumed a very singular and terrible cast, as they ran the gamut betwixt dronings of dull acquiescence and explosions of frantic pain or fury, ramblings of conversations and whines of entreaty, pantings of eagerness and shouts of protest. They appeared to be in different languages, all known to Cohen, whose rasping accents were frequently distinguishable in reply, reproof, or threatening. Sometimes it seemed that several persons must be in the house, Cohen, certain captives, and the guards of those captives. There were voices of a sort that neither Whedon nor Smith had ever heard before, despite their wide knowledge of foreign parts, and many that they did seem to place as belonging to this or that nationality. The nature of the conversation seemed always a kind of catechism, as if Cohen were extorting some sort of information from terrified or rebellious prisoners. Whedon had many verbatim reports of overheard scraps in his notebook for English, French, and Spanish which he knew were frequently used, but of these nothing has survived. He did, however, say that besides a few ghoulish dialogues in which the past affairs of Providence families were concerned, most of the questions and answers he could understand were historical or scientific, occasionally pertaining to very remote places and ages. Once, for example, an alternately raging and sullen figure was questioned in French about the Black Prince's massacre at Limonest in 1370, as if there were some hidden reason which he ought to know. Cohen asked the prisoner, if prisoner it were, whether the order to slay was given because of the sign of the goat found on the altar in the ancient Roman crypt beneath the cathedral, or whether the dark man of the Haute-Vigne Coven had spoken the 3 words. Failing to obtain replies, the inquisitor had seemingly resorted to extreme means, for there was a terrific shriek, followed by silence and muttering and a bumping sound. None of these colloquies were ever ocularly witnessed, since the windows were always heavily draped. Once, though, during the discourse in an unknown tongue, a shadow was seen on the curtain which startled Whedon exceedingly, reminding him of one of the puppets in a show he had seen in the autumn of 1764 in Hacker's Hall, when a man from Germantown, Pennsylvania, had given a clever mechanical spectacle advertised as a view of the famous city of Jerusalem, in which are represented Jerusalem, the Temple of Solomon, his royal throne, the noted towers and hills, likewise the sufferings of our Saviour from the Garden of Gethsemane to the cross on the hill of Golgotha, an artful piece of statuary worthy to be seen by the curious. It was on this occasion that the listener, who had crept close to the window of the front room whence the speaking proceeded, gave a start which roused the old Indian pair and caused them to loose the dogs around him. After that no more conversations were ever heard in the house, and Whedon and Smith concluded that Cohen had transferred his field of action to regions below. That such regions in truth existed seemed amply clear from many things. Faint cries and groans unmistakably came up now and then from what appeared to be the solid earth in places far from any structure, whilst hidden in the bushes along the river-bank in the rear, where the high ground sloped steeply down to the valley of the Pawtuxet, there was found an arched oaken door in a frame of heavy masonry, which was obviously an entrance to caverns within the hill. When or how these catacombs could have been constructed, Whedon was unable to say, but he frequently pointed out how easily the place might have been reached by bands of unseen workmen from the river. Joseph Cohen put his mongrel seamen to diverse uses indeed. During the heavy spring rains of 1769, the two watchers kept a sharp eye on the steep riverbank to see if any subterranean secrets might be washed to light, and were rewarded by the sight of a profusion of both human and animal bones in places where deep gullies had been worn in the banks. Naturally, there might be many explanations of such things in the rear of a stock farm, and in a locality where old Indian burying grounds were common, but Whedon and Smith drew their own inferences. It was in January 1770, whilst Whedon and Smith were still debating vainly on what, if anything, to think or do about the whole bewildering business, that the incident of the Fortaleza occurred. Exasperated by the burning of the revenue sloop Liberty at Newport during the previous summer, the customs fleet under Admiral Wallace had adopted an increased vigilance concerning strange vessels, and on this occasion His Majesty's armed schooner Sigenet, under Captain Charles Leslie, captured after a short pursuit one early morning the snow Fortaleza of Barcelona, Spain, under Captain Manuel Arunda, bound according to its log from Gan Cairo, Egypt, to Providence. When searched for contraband material, this ship revealed the astonishing fact that its cargo consisted exclusively of Egyptian mummies, consigned to sailor A.B.C., who would come to remove his goods in a lighter just off Namquit Point, and whose identity Captain Arunda felt himself in honor bound not to reveal. The Vice-Admiralty Court of Newport, at a loss what to do in view of the non-contraband nature of the cargo on the one hand, and of the unlawful secrecy of the entry on the other hand, compromised on Collector Robinson's recommendation by freeing the ship, but forbidding it a port in Rhode Island waters. There were later rumors of its having been seen in Boston Harbor, though it never openly entered the port of Boston. This extraordinary incident did not fail of wide remark in Providence, and there were not many who doubted the existence of some connection between the cargo of mummies and the sinister Joseph Cohen. His exotic studies and his curious chemical importations being common knowledge, and his fondness for graveyards being common suspicion. It did not take much imagination to link him with a freakish importation, which could not conceivably have been destined for anyone else in the town. As if conscious of this natural belief, Cohen took care to speak casually on several occasions of the chemical value of the balsams found in mummies, thinking perhaps that he might make the affair seem less unnatural, yet stopping just short of admitting his participation. Whedon and Smith, of course, felt no doubt whatsoever of the significance of the thing, and indulged in the wildest theories concerning Cohen and his monstrous labours. The following spring, like that of the year before, had heavy rains, and the watchers kept careful track of the river bank behind the Cohen farm. Large sections were washed away, and a certain number of bones discovered, but no glimpse was afforded of any actual subterranean chambers or burrows. Something was rumoured, however, at the village of Pawtuxet about a mile below, where the river flows and falls over a rocky terrace to join the placid landlocked cove. There, where quaint old cottages climbed the hill from the rustic bridge, and fishing smacks lay anchored at their sleepy docks, a vague report went round of things that were floating down the river and flashing into sight for a minute as they went over the falls. Of course, the Pawtuxet is a long river, which winds through many settled regions abounding in graveyards, and of course the spring rains had been very heavy. But the fisherfolk about the bridge did not like the wild way that one of the things stared as it shot down to the still waters below, or the way that another half cried out, although its condition had greatly departed from that of objects which normally cry out. That rumour sent Smith, for Whedon was just then at sea, in haste to the river bank behind the farm, where surely enough there remained the evidences of an extensive cave-in. There was, however, no trace of a passage into the steep bank, for the miniature avalanche had left behind a solid wall of mixed earth and shrubbery from aloft. Smith went to the extent of some experimental digging, but was deterred by lack of success, or perhaps by fear of possible success. It is interesting to speculate on what the persistent and revengeful Whedon would have done had he been ashore at the time. 4. By the autumn of 1770, Whedon decided that the time was ripe to tell others of his discoveries, for he had a large number of facts to link together, and a second eyewitness to refute the possible charge of that jealousy and vindictiveness had spurred his fancy. As his first confidant he selected Captain James Mathewson of the Enterprise, who on the one hand knew him well enough not to doubt his veracity, and on the other hand was sufficiently influential in the town to be heard in turn with respect. The colloquy took place in an upper room of Sabin's Tavern near the docks, with Smith present to corroborate virtually every statement, and it could be seen that Captain Mathewson was tremendously impressed. Like nearly everyone else in the town, he had black suspicions of his own anent Joseph Cohen. Hence it needed only this confirmation and enlargement of data to convince him absolutely. At the end of the conference he was very grave, and enjoined strict silence upon the two younger men. He would, he said, transmit the information separately to some 10 or so of the most learned and prominent citizens of Providence, ascertaining their views and following whatever advice they might have to offer. Secrecy would probably be essential in any case, for this was no matter that the town constables or militia could cope with, and above all else, the excitable crowd must be kept in ignorance, lest there be enacted in these already troublous times a repetition of that frightful Salem panic of less than a century before, which had first brought Cohen hither. The right persons to tell, he believed, would be Dr. Benjamin West, whose pamphlet on the late transit of Venus proved him a scholar and a keen thinker, Reverend James Manning, president of the college which had just moved up from Warren and was temporarily housed in the new King Street schoolhouse awaiting the completion of its building on the hill above Presbyterian Lane. Ex-Governor Stephen Hopkins, who had been a member of the Philosophical Society at Newport and was a man of very broad perceptions. John Carter, publisher of the Gazette. All 4 of the Brown brothers, John, Joseph, Nicholas, and Moses, who formed the recognized local magnates, and of whom Joseph was an amateur scientist of parts. Or Dr. Jabez Bowen, whose erudition was considerable, and who had much first-hand knowledge of Cohen's odd purchases, and Captain Abraham Whipple, a privateersman of phenomenal boldness and energy, who could be counted on to lead in any active measures needed. These men, if favorable, might eventually be brought together for collective deliberation, and with them would rest the responsibility of deciding whether or not to inform the governor of the colony, Joseph Wanton of Newport, before taking action. The mission of Captain Mathewson prospered beyond his highest expectations, for whilst he found 1 or 2 of the chosen confidants somewhat skeptical of the possible ghastly side of Whedon's tale, there was not one who did not think it necessary to take some sort of secret and coordinated action. Cohen, it was clear, formed a vague potential menace to the welfare of the town and colony, and must be eliminated at any cost. Late in December 1770, a group of eminent townsmen met at the home of Stephen Hopkins and debated tentative measures. Whedon's notes, which he had given to Captain Mathewson, were carefully read, and he and Smith were summoned to give testimony and details. Something very like fear seized the whole assemblage before the meeting was over, though there ran through that fear a grim determination, which Captain Whipple's bluff and resonant profanity best expressed. They would not notify the governor, because a more than legal cause seemed necessary. With hidden powers of uncertain extent apparently at his disposal, Cohen was not a man who could safely be warned to leave town. Nameless reprisals might ensue, and even if the sinister creature complied, the removal would be no more than the shifting of an unclean burden to another place. The times were lawless, and men who had flouted the king's revenue forces for years were not the ones to balk at sterner things when duty impelled. Cohen must be surprised at his Pawtuxet farm by a large raiding party of seasoned privateersmen, and given one decisive chance to explain himself. If he proved a madman, amusing himself with shrieks and imaginary conversations in different voices, he would be properly confined. If something graver appeared, and if the underground horrors indeed turned out to be real, he and all with him must die. It could be done quietly, and even the widow and her father need not be told how it came about. While these serious steps were under discussion, there occurred in the town an incident so terrible and inexplicable that for a time little else was mentioned for miles around. In the middle of a moonlight January night with heavy snow underfoot, there resounded over the river and up the hill a shocking series of cries which brought sleepy heads to every window, and people around Weybosset Point saw a great white thing plunging frantically along the badly cleared space in the front of Turk's Head. There was a baying of dogs in the distance, but this subsided as soon as the clamor of the awakened town became audible. Parties of men with lanterns and muskets hurried out to see what was happening, but nothing rewarded their search. The next morning, however, a giant muscular body, stark naked, was found on the jams of ice around the southern piers of the Great Bridge, where the long dock stretched out beside Abbott's Distil House, and the identity of this object became a theme for endless speculation and whispering. It was not so much the younger as the older folk who whispered, for only in the patriarchs did that frigid face with horror in bulging eyes strike any chord of memory. They, shaking as they did so, exchanged furtive murmurs of wonder and fear, for in those stiff, hideous features lay a resemblance so marvelous as to be almost an identity, and that identity was a man who had died full 50 years before. Ezra Whedon was present at the finding, and remembering the baying of the night before, set along Weybosset Street and across Muddy Dog Bridge whence the sound had come. He had a curious expectancy, and was not surprised when, reaching the edge of the settled district where the street merged into the Pawtuxet Road, he came upon some very curious tracks in the snow. The naked giant had been pursued by the dogs and many booted men, and the returning tracks of the hounds and their masters could be easily traced. They had given up the chase upon coming too near the town. Whedon smiled grimly, and as a perfunctory detail, traced the footprints back to their source. It was the Pawtuxet farm of Joseph Cohen, as he well knew it would be, and he would have given much had the yard been less confusingly trampled. As it was, he dared not seem too interested in full daylight. Dr. Bowen, to whom Whedon went at once with his report, performed an autopsy on the strange corpse, and discovered peculiarities which baffled him utterly. The digestive tracts of the huge man seemed never to have been in use, whilst the whole skin had a coarse, loosely knit texture impossible to account for. Impressed by what the old man whispered of this body's likeness to the long-dead blacksmith Daniel Green, whose great-grandson Aaron Hoppin was a supercargo in Cohen's employ, Whedon asked casual questions till he found where Green was buried. That night a party of 10 visited the old North burying ground opposite Herenders Lane, and opened the grave. They found it vacant, precisely as they had expected. Meanwhile, arrangements had been made with the post-riders to intercept Joseph Cohen's mail, and shortly before the incident of the naked body, there was found a letter from one Jedediah Owen of Salem, which made the cooperating citizens think deeply. Parts of it, copied and preserved in the private archives of the Smith family where Charles Ward found it, ran as follows. I delight that you continually getting at old matters in your way, and do not think better was done in Mr. Hutchinson's in Salem village. Certainly, there was nothing but your evilest awfulness in that which H raised up from what he could gather only a part of. What you sent did not work, whether because of anything missing, or because ye words were not right from my speaking or ye copying. I alone am at the loss. I have not ye chemical art to follow ye else, and only myself confounded by ye seventh bookie of ye Necronomicon that you recommend ye. But I would have you observe what was told to us about taking care whom to call you up, for you are sensible what Mr. Malte writ in ye Magnalia of, and can judge how truly that horrendous thing is reported. I say to you again, do not call up any that you cannot put down, by the which I mean any that can in turn call up somewhat against you, whereby your powerfulest devices may not be of use. Ask of the lesser, lest the greater shall not wish to answer, and shall command more than you. I was frightened when I read of your knowing what Ben Zariatnamik had in his ebony boxy, for I was conscious who must have told you. And again I ask that you shall write me as Jedediah and not Simon. In this community a man may not live too long, and you know my plan by which I came back as my son. I am desirous you will acquaint me with what ye black men learned from Sylvanus Coccidus in ye vault, under ye Roman wall, and will be obliged for ye lending of ye you speak of. Another and unsigned letter from Philadelphia provoked equal thought, especially for the following passage. I will observe what you say respecting the sending of accounts only by ye vessels, but cannot always be certain when to expect them. In the matter spoke of, I require only one more thing, but wish to be sure I apprehend you exactly. You inform me that no part must be missing if the finest effects are to be had, but you cannot but know how hard it is to be sure. It seems a great hazard and burden to take away the whole box, and in town, in example St. Peter's, St. Paul's, St. Mary's, or Christ Church, it can scarce be done at all. But I know what imperfections were in the one I raised up October last, and how many live specimens you were forced to employ before you hit upon the right mode in the year 1766, so will be guided by you in all matters. I am impatient for ye brig, and inquire daily at Mr. Biddle's wharf. A third suspicious letter was in an unknown tongue, and even an unknown alphabet. In the Smith diary found by Charles Ward, a single oft-repeated combination of characters is clumsily copied, and authorities at Brown University have pronounced the alphabet Amharic or Abyssinian, although they do not recognize the word. None of these epistles was ever delivered to Cohen, though the disappearance of Jedediah Orne from Salem, as recorded shortly afterward, showed that the Providence men took certain quiet steps. The Pennsylvania Historical Society also has some curious letters received by Dr. Shippen regarding the presence of an unwholesome character in Philadelphia. But more decisive steps were in the air, and it is in the secret assemblages of sworn and tested sailors and faithful old privateersmen in the brown warehouses by night that we must look for the main fruits of Whedon's disclosures. Slowly and surely, a plan of campaign was under development which would leave no trace of Joseph Cohen's noxious mysteries. Cohen, despite all precautions, apparently felt that something was in the wind, for he was now remarked to wear an unusually worried look. His coach was seen at all hours in the town and on the Pawtuxet Road, and he dropped little by little the air of forced geniality with which he had latterly sought to combat the town's prejudice. The nearest neighbors to his farm, the Fenners, one night remarked a great shaft of light shooting into the sky from some aperture in the roof of the cryptical stone building, with the high, excessively narrow windows, an event which they quickly communicated to John Brown in Providence. Mr. Brown had become the executive leader of the select group bent on Cohen's extirpation, and had informed the Fenners that some action was about to be taken. This he deemed needful, because of the impossibility of their not witnessing the final raid, and he explained his course by saying that Cohen was known to be a spy of the customs officers at Newport, against whom the hunt of every Providence shipper, merchant, and farmer was openly or clandestinely raised. Whether the ruse was wholly believed by neighbors who had seen so many queer things is not certain, but at any rate, the Fenners were willing to connect any evil with a man of such queer ways. To them Mr. Brown had trusted the duty of watching the Cowen farmhouse, and of regularly reporting every incident which took place there. 5. The probability that Cowen was on guard and attempting unusual things, as suggested by the odd shaft of light, precipitated at last the action so carefully devised by the band of serious citizens. According to the Smith diary, a company of about 100 men met at 10 p.m. on Friday, April 20th, 1771, in the great room of Thurston's Tower at the sign of the Golden Lion on Weybosset Point, across the bridge. Of the guiding group of prominent men, in addition to the leader John Brown, there were present Dr. Bowen, with his case of surgical instruments, President Manning without the great periwig, the largest in the colonies, for which he was noted, Governor Hopkins, wrapped in his dark cloak and accompanied by his seafaring brother Essex, whom he had initiated at the last moment with the permission of the rest, John Carter, Captain Mathewson, and Captain Whipple, who was to lead the actual riding party. These chiefs conferred apart in a rear chamber, after which Captain Whipple emerged to the great room and gave the gathered seamen their last oaths and instructions. Eleazar Smith was with the leaders as they sat in the rear apartment awaiting the arrival of Ezra Whedon, whose duty was to keep track of Cowen and report the departure of his coach for the farm. About 10:30, a heavy rumble was heard on the great bridge, followed by the sound of a coach in the street aside. And at that hour, there was no need of waiting for Whedon in order to know that the doomed man had set out for his last night of unhallowed wizardry. A moment later, as the receding coach clattered faintly over the muddy dock bridge, Whedon appeared, and the raiders fell silently into military order in the street, shooting the firelocks, fowling pieces, or whaling harpoons which they had with them. Whedon and Smith were with the party, and of deliberating citizens, there were present for active service Captain Whipple, the leader, Captain Essex Hopkins, John Carter, President Manning, Captain Mathewson, and Dr. Bowen, together with Moses Brown, who had come up at the 11th hour, though absent from the preliminary session at the tavern. All these freemen and their 100 sailors began the long march without delay, grim and a trifle apprehensive, as they left the muddy dock behind and mounted the gentle rise of Broad Street toward the Pawtuxet Road. Just beyond Elder Snow's church, some of the men turned back to take a parting look at the Providence lying outspread under the early spring stars. Steeples and gables rose dark and shapely, and salt breezes swept up gently from the cove north of the bridge. Vega was climbing above the great hill across the water, whose crest of trees was broken by the roofline of the unfinished college edifice. At the foot of that hill, and along the narrow mountain lanes of its side, the old town dreamed, old Providence, for whose safety and sanity so monstrous and colossal a blasphemy was about to be wiped out. An hour and a quarter later, the raiders arrived, as previously agreed, at the Fenner farmhouse, where they heard a final report on their intended victim. He had reached his farm over half an hour before, and the strange light had soon afterwards shot once more into the sky, but there were no lights in any visible windows. This was always the case of late. Even as this news was given, another great glare arose toward the south, and the party realized that they had indeed come close to the scene of awesome and unnatural wonders. Captain Whipple now ordered his force to separate into 3 divisions, one of 20 men under Eleazar Smith to strike across to the shore and guard the landing place against possible reinforcements for Cohen until summoned by a messenger for desperate service. A second of 20 men under Captain Essex Hopkins to steal down into the river valley behind the Cohen farm and demolish with axes or gunpowder the oaken door in the high steep bank, and the third to close in on the house and adjacent buildings themselves. Of this division, 1/3 was to be led by Captain Matthewson to the cryptical stone edifice with high narrow windows, another third to follow Captain Whipple himself to the main farmhouse, and the remaining third to preserve a circle around the whole group of buildings until summoned by a final emergency signal. The river party would break down the hillside door at the sound of a single whistle blast, then waiting and capturing anything which might issue from the regions within. At the sound of 2 whistle blasts, it would advance through the aperture to oppose the enemy or join the rest of the raiding contingent. The party at the stone building would accept these receptive signals in an analogous manner, forcing an entrance at the first, and at the second, descending whatever passage into the ground might be discovered, and joining the general or focal warfare expected to take place within the caverns. A third or emergency signal of 3 blasts would summon the immediate reserve from its general guard duty, its 20 men dividing equally and entering the unknown depths through both farmhouse and stone building. Captain Whipple's belief in the existence of catacombs was absolute, and he took no alternative into consideration when making his plans. He had with him a whistle of great power and shrillness, and did not fear any upsetting or misunderstanding of signals. The final reserve at the landing, of course, was nearly out of the whistle's range, hence would require a special messenger if needed for help. Moses Brown and John Carter went with Captain Hopkins to the riverbank, while President Manning was detailed with Captain Matthewson to the stone building. Dr. Bowen with Ezra Whedon remained in Captain Whipple's party, which was to storm the farmhouse itself. The attack was to begin as soon as a messenger from Captain Hopkins had joined Captain Whipple to notify him of the river party's readiness. The leader would then deliver the loud single blast, and the various advance parties would commence their simultaneous attack on 3 points. Shortly before 1 a.m., the 3 divisions left the Fenner farmhouse, one to guard the landing, another to seek the river valley and the hillside door, and the third to subdivide and attend to the actual buildings of the Cohen farm. Eleazar Smith, who accompanied the shore guarding party, records in his diary an uneventful march and a long wait on the bluff by the bay, broken once by what seemed to be the distant sound of the single whistle, and again by a peculiar muffled blend of roaring and crying and a powder blast which seemed to come from the same direction. Later on, one man thought he caught some distant gunshots, and still later, Smith himself felt the throb of titanic and thunderous words resounding in upper air. It was just before dawn that a single haggard messenger with wild eyes and a hideous unknown odor about his clothing appeared and told the detachment to disperse quietly to their homes and never again think or speak of the night's doings or of him who had been Joseph Cohen. Something about the bearing of the messenger carried a conviction which his mere words could never have conveyed, for though he was a seaman well known to many of them, there was something obscurely lost or gained in his soul which set him forevermore apart. It was the same later on when they met other old companions who had gone into the zone of horror. Most of them had lost or gained something imponderable and indescribable. They had seen or heard or felt something which was not for human creatures and could not forget it. From them there was never any gossip, for to even the commonest of mortal instincts there are terrible boundaries. And from that single messenger the party at the shore caught a nameless awe which almost sealed their own lips. Very few are the rumors which ever came from any of them, and Eleazar Smith's diary is the only written record which has survived from the whole expedition which set forth from the sign of the Golden Lion under the stars. Charles Ward, however, discovered another vague sidelight in some Fenner correspondence which he found in New London, where he knew another branch of the family had lived. It seems that the Fenners, from whose house the doomed farm was distantly visible, had watched the departing columns of raiders, and had heard very clearly the angry barking of the caravan dogs, followed by the first shrill blast which precipitated the attack. This blast had been followed by a repetition of the great shaft of light from the stone building, and in another moment, after a quick sounding of the second signal ordering a general invasion, there had come a subdued prattle of musketry, followed by a horrible roaring cry, which the correspondent Luke Fenner had represented in his epistle by the characters "war, war." This cry, however, had possessed a quality which no mere writing could convey, and the correspondent mentions that his mother fainted completely at the sound. It was later repeated less soundly, and further but more muffled evidences of gunfire ensued, together with a loud explosion of powder from the direction of the river. About an hour afterward, all the dogs began to bark frightfully, and there were vague ground rumblings so marked that the candlesticks tottered on the mantelpiece. A strong smell of sulphur was noted, and Luke Fenner's father declared that he had heard the third or emergency whistle signal, though the others failed to detect it. Muffled musketry sounded again, followed by a deep scream less piercing, but even more horrible than those which had preceded it. A kind of throaty, nastily plastic cough or gargle whose quality as a scream must have come more from its continuity and psychological import than from its actual acoustic value. Then the flaming thing burst into sight at a point where the caravan farm ought to lie, and the human cries of desperate and frightened men were heard. Muskets flashed and cracked, and the flaming thing fell to the ground. A second flaming thing appeared, and a shriek of human origin was plainly distinguished. Fenner wrote that he could even gather a few words belched in frenzy, "Almighty protect thy lamb." Then there were more shots, and the second flaming thing fell. After that came silence for about 3/4 of an hour, at the end of which time little Arthur Fenner, Luke's brother, exclaimed that he saw a red fog going up to the stars from the accursed farm in the distance. No one but the child can testify to this, but Luke admits the significant coincidence implied by the panic of almost convulsive fright, which at the same moment arched the backs and stiffened the fur of the 3 cats then within the room. 5 minutes later, a chill wind blew up, and the air became suffused with such an intolerable stench that only the strong freshness of the sea could have prevented it being noticed by the shore party or by any wakeful souls in Pawtuxet village. This stench was nothing which any of the Fenners had ever encountered before, and produced a kind of clutching, amorphous fear beyond that of the tomb or the charnel house. Close upon it came the awful voice which no hapless hearer will ever be able to forget. It thundered out of the sky like a doom, and windows rattled as its echoes died away. It was deep and musical, powerful as a bass organ, but evil as the forbidden books of the Arabs. What it said no man can tell, for it spoke in an unknown tongue, but this is the writing Luke Fenner set down to portray the demoniac intonations. Dismis, Jeshet, Bon, Dosifi Duvima Enitemos. Not till the year 1919 did any soul link this crude transcript with anything else in mortal knowledge. But Charles Ward paled as he recognized what Mirandola had denounced in Shudders as the ultimate horror among black magic's incantations. An unmistakably human shout or deep chorused scream seemed to answer this malign wonder from the Cohen farm, after which the unknown stench grew complex with an added odor equally intolerable. A wailing distinctly different from the scream now burst out, and was protracted ululantly in rising and falling paroxysms. At times it became almost articulate, though no auditor could trace any definite words, and at one point it seemed to verge towards the confines of diabolic and hysterical laughter. Then a yell of utter, ultimate fright and stark madness ranged from scores of human throats, a yell which came strong and clear despite the depths from which it must have burst, after which darkness and silence ruled all things. Spirals of acrid smoke ascended to blot out the stars, though no flames appeared and no buildings were observed to be gone or injured on the following day. Toward dawn, two frightened messengers with monstrous and unplaceable odors saturating their clothes knocked at the Fenner door and requested a keg of rum, for which they paid very well indeed. One of them told the family that the affair of Joseph Carwin was over, and that the events of the night were not to be mentioned again. Arrogant as the order seemed, the aspect of him who gave it took away all resentment and lent it a fearsome authority, so that only these furtive letters of Luke Fenner, which he urged his Connecticut relative to destroy, remained to tell what was seen and heard. The non-compliance of that relative, whereby the letters were saved after all, has alone kept the matter from a merciful oblivion. Charles Ward had one detail to add as a result of a long canvass of Pawtuxet residents for ancestral traditions. Old Charles Slocum of that village said that there was known to his grandfather a queer rumor concerning a charred, distorted body found in the fields a week after the death of Joseph Carwin was announced. What kept the talk alive was the notion that his body, so far as could be seen in its burnt and twisted condition, was neither thoroughly human nor wholly allied to any animal which Pawtuxet folk had ever seen or read about. 6. Not one man who participated in that terrible raid could ever be induced to say a word concerning it, and every fragment of the vague data which survives comes from those outside the final fighting party. There is something frightful in the curve with which these actual raiders destroyed each scrap which bore the least allusion to the matter. 8 sailors had been killed, but although their bodies were not produced, their families were satisfied with the statement that a clash with customs officers had occurred. The same statement also covered the numerous cases of wounds, all of which were extensively bandaged and treated only by Dr. Jabez Bowen, who had accompanied the party. Hardest to explain was the nameless odor clinging to all the raiders, a thing which was discussed for weeks. Of the citizen leaders, Captain Whipple and Moses Brown were more severely hurt, and letters of their wives testified the bewilderment which the residence and close guarding of their bandages produced. Psychologically, every participant was aged, sobered, and shaken. It is fortunate that they were all strong men of action and simple orthodox religionists, for with more subtle introspectiveness and mental complexity, they would have fared ill indeed. President Manning was the most disturbed, but even he outgrew the darkest shadow and smothered memories in prayers. Every man of those leaders had a stirring part to play in later years, and it is perhaps fortunate that this is so. Little more than a 12-month after Captain Whipple led the mob who burned the revenue ship Gaspee, and in this bold act we may trace one step in the blotting out of unwholesome images. There was delivered to the widow of Joseph Cohen a sealed, laden coffin of curious design, obviously found ready on the spot when needed, in which she was told her husband's body lay. He had, it was explained, been killed in a customs battle about which it was not politic to give details. More than this no tongue ever uttered of Joseph Cowen's end, and Charles Ward had only a single hint wherewith to construct a theory. This hint was the merest thread, a shaky underscoring of a passage in Jedediah Owen's confiscated letter to Cohen, as partly copied in Ezra Whedon's handwriting. The copy was found in the possession of Smith's descendants, and we are left to decide whether Whedon gave it to his companion after the end as a mute clue to the abnormality which had occurred, or whether, as is more probable, Smith had it before and added the underscoring himself from what he had managed to extract from his friend by shrewd guessing and unduly cross-questioning. The underlined passage is merely this: I say to you again, do not call up any that you cannot put down, by the which I mean any that can in turn call up somewhat against you, whereby your powerfulest devices may not be of use. Ask of the lesser, lest the greater shall not wish to answer, and shall command thee more than you. In the light of this passage, and reflecting on what last unmentionable allies a beaten man might try to summon in his direst extremity, Charles Ward may well have wondered whether any citizen of Providence killed Joseph Cohen. The deliberate effacement of every memory of the dead man from Providence life and annals was vastly aided by the influence of the riding leaders. They had not at first meant to be so thorough, and had allowed the widow and her father and child to remain in ignorance of the true conditions. But Captain Tillinghast was an astute man, and soon uncovered enough rumors to whet his horror, and cause him to demand that his daughter and granddaughter change their name, burn the library and all remaining papers, and chisel the inscription from the slate slab above Joseph Cowen's grave. He knew Captain Whipple well, and probably extracted more hints from that bluff mariner than anyone else ever gained respecting the end of the accused sorcerer. From that time on, the obliteration of Cowen's memory became increasingly rigid, extending at last by common consent even to the town records and files of the Gazette. It can be compared in spirit only to the hush that lay on Oscar Wilde's name for a decade after his disgrace, and in extent only to the fate of that sinful king of Runazar in Lord Dunstan's tale, whom the gods decided must not only cease to be, but must cease ever to have been. Mrs. Tillinghast, as the widow became known after 1772, sold the house in Olney Court and resided with her father in Powers Lane till her death in 1817. The farm at Pawtuxet, shunned by every living soul, remained to moulder through the years, and seemed to decay with uncountable rapidity. By 1780, only the stone and brickwork were standing, and by 1800s, even these had fallen to shapeless heaps. None ventured to pierce the tangled shrubbery on the river bank behind, which the hillside door may have lain, nor did any try to frame a definite image of the scenes amidst which Joseph Cowen departed from the horrors he had wrought. Only robust Captain Whipple was heard by alert listeners to mutter once in a while to himself, "Pox on that! But he had no business to laugh while he screamed. 'Twas as though the damned had somewhat up his sleeve. For half a crown I'd burn his house." Chapter 3. A Search and an Evocation. 1. Charles Ward, as we have seen, first learned in 1918 of his descent from Joseph Cohen. That he at once took an intense interest in everything pertaining to the bygone mystery is not to be wondered at, for every vague rumor that he had heard of Cohen now became something vital to himself, in whom flowed Cohen's blood. No spirited and imaginative genealogist could have done otherwise than begin forthwith an avid and systematic collection of Cohen data. In his first delvings there was not the slightest attempt at secrecy, so that even Dr. Lyman hesitates to date the youth's madness from any period before the close of 1919. He talked freely with his family, though his mother was not particularly pleased to own an ancestor like Cohen, and with the officials of the various museums and libraries he visited. In applying to private families for records thought to be in their possession, he made no concealment of his object and shared the somewhat amused skepticism with which the accounts of the old diarists and letter writers were regarded. He often expressed a keen wonder as to what really had taken place a century and a half before at that Pawtuxet farmhouse, whose site he vainly tried to find, and what Joseph Cohen really had been. When he came across the Smith diary and archives and encountered the letter from Jedediah Owen, he decided to visit Salem and look up the Cohen's early activities and connections there, which he did during the Easter vacation of 1919. At the Essex Institute, which was well known to him from former sojourns in the glamorous old town of crumbling Puritan gables and clustered gable roofs, he was very kindly received and unearthed there a considerable amount of Cohen data. He found that his ancestor was born in Salem village, now Danvers, 7 miles from town, on the 18th of February, Old Style, 1662-3, and that he had run away to sea at the age of 15, not appearing again for 9 years, when he returned with the speech, dress, and manners of a native Englishman and settled in Salem proper. At that time he had little to do with his family, but spent most of his hours with the curious books he had brought from Europe, and the strange chemicals which came for him on ships from England, France, and Holland. Certain trips of his into the country were the objects of much local inquisitiveness, and were whisperingly associated with vague rumors of fires on the hills at night. Cohen's only close friends had been one Edward Hutchinson of Salem village and one Simon Owen of Salem. With these men he was often seen in conference about the common, and visits among them were by no means infrequent. Hutchinson had a house well out toward the woods, and it was not altogether liked by sensitive people because of the sounds heard there at night. He was said to entertain strange visitors, and the lights seen from his windows were not always of the same color. The knowledge he displayed concerning long-dead persons and long-forgotten events was considered distinctly unwholesome, and he disappeared about the time the witchcraft panic began, never to be heard from again. At that time, Joseph Cohen also departed, but his settlement in Providence was soon learned of. Simon Owen lived in Salem until 1720, when his failure to grow visibly old began to excite attention. He thereafter disappeared, though 30 years later his precise counterpart and self-styled son turned up to claim his property. The claim was allowed on the strength of documents in Simon Owen's known hand, and Jedediah Owen continued to dwell in Salem till 1771, when certain letters from Providence citizens to the Reverend Thomas Barnard and others brought about his quiet removal to parts unknown. Certain documents by and about all of these strange characters were available at the Essex Institute, the courthouse, and the Registry of Deeds, and included both harmless commonplaces such as land titles and bills of sale, and furtive fragments of a more provocative nature. There were 4 or 5 unmistakable allusions to them on the witchcraft trial records, as when one Hephzibah Lawson swore on July 10, 1692, at the court of Oyer and Terminer under Judge Hawthorne, that 40 witches and the Blackie man were wont to meet in the woods behind Mr. Hutchinson's house. And one Amity Howe declared at a session of August 8th before Judge Gedney that Mr. G.B., Reverend George Burroughs, on that night put he dewel his marquee upon Bridget S., Jonathan A., Simon O., Deliverance W., Joseph C., Susan P., Mehetable C., and Deborah B. Then there was a catalogue of Hutchinson's uncanny library as found after his disappearance, and an unfinished manuscript in his handwriting, couched in a cipher none could read. Ward had a photostatic copy of this manuscript made, and began to work casually on the cipher as soon as it was delivered to him. After the following August, his labors on the cipher became intense and feverish, and there is reason to believe from his speech and conduct that he hit upon the key before October or November. He never stated, though, whether or not he had succeeded. But of the greatest immediate interest was the own material. It took Maud only a short time to prove from identity of penmanship a thing he had already considered established from the text of the letter to Cohen, namely that Simon Owen and his supposed son were one and the same person. As Owen had said to his correspondent, it was hardly safe to live too long in Salem, hence he resorted to a 30-year sojourn abroad, and did not return to claim his lands except as a representative of a new generation. Owen had apparently been careful to destroy most of his correspondence, but the citizens who took action in 1771 found and preserved a few letters and papers which excited the wonder. There were cryptic formulae and diagrams in his and other hands, which Ward now either copied with care or had photographed, and one extremely mysterious letter, in a chirography that the searcher recognized from items in the Registry of Deeds as positively Joseph Cohen's. This Cohen letter, though undated as to the year, was evidently not the one in answer to which Owen had written the confiscated missive, and, from internal evidence, Ward placed it not much later than 1750. It may not be amiss to give the text in full, as a sample of the style of one whose history was so dark and terrible. The recipient is addressed as Simon, but a line, whether drawn by Cohen or Orne, Ward could not tell, is run through the word. Prudence. 1st May, UT Vulgo. Brother, my honored anti-friend friend, due respects and earnest wishes to him whom we serve for ye eternal power. I am just come upon that which you ought to know concerning the matter of the last extremity and what to do regarding it. I am not disposed to follow you in going away on account of my years, for prudence hath not ye sharpness of ye bay in hunting out uncommon things and bringing ye to furl. I am tied up in shippes and goodies, and could not do as you did, Besides the witchy my farmy at Patuxet have under it what you know that would not wait for my coming back as an other. But I am unready for hardy fortunes, as I her told you, and her long worked upon ye way of getting backy after ye lasted. I last night struck ye on ye words that bring up Yogi Sotofi, and sorry for ye first time that face spoke of by Ibn Shakabo in ye. And it said that ye fed psalmi in ye liber damnatus holes ye clavicle. With Sunny in fifth house, Saturni in trine, draw ye pentagram of fire, and say ninth verse thrice. This verse repeat ichi rudemas and house ear, and ye think will breathe in ye outside spheres. And of ye city of old shall one be born, who shall look backy, though knowing not what he seeks. Yet will this avail ye nothing if there be no air, and if the salts, or the way to make the salts, be not ready for his handy. And here I will own, I have not taken needed steps, nor found much. Ye process is plaguey hardy to come needy, and it uses up such a store of specimens. I am hardy putty to it to get enough, notwithstanding the sailors I have from ye Indies. Ye people here ye become curious, but I can stand them off. Ye gentry are worse than the populace, be more circumstantial in their accounts, and more believed in what they tell. That parson and Mr. Merritt have talked some, I am fearful, but no thing so far is dangerous. Ye chemical substances are easy of getting. There be two goody chemists in towny, Dr. Bowen and Sam Carew. I am fogged out what Borel's safe, and ho helping Abdul al-Hazret's his seventh bookie. Whatever I get you shall ha. And in ye meanwhile, do not neglect to make use of ye words I heard here gyn. I heard them righty, but if you desire to see him, employ the writings on a piece of that I am putting in this packet. Say verses every rude mess and Hallows Eve, and if ye line run out not, one shall be in years to come that shall look ye back, and use what salts or stuff for salts you shall leave him. Job 14th. I rejoice you are again at Salem, and hope I may see you not long hence. I have a goody stallion, and am thinking of getting a coach, there being one Mr. Merritt's, in Prudence already, though ye roads are bad. If you are disposed to travel, do not pass me by. From Boston take ye post roads through Deadman, Renfman, and Attleboro, goody taverns being at all these towns. Stop at Mr. Bolcomb's in Retnam, where ye beds are finer than Mr. Hatch's, but eat ye at ye other house for their cookies better. Turn into Prue by Pawtucket Falls, and ye past Mr. Sailor's tavern. My house opposite Mr. Epitenius Olney's tavern of ye Town Street is on ye northern side of Olney's Court, distance from Boston Stone, about XLE 5 miles. Sir, I am ye olde and true friend and servant, in almusin metraiton, Josephus C. To Mr. Simon Owen, Williams Lane, in Salem. This letter, oddly enough, was what first gave Ward the exact location of Carwen's Providence home, for none of the records encountered up to that time had been at all specific. The discovery was doubly striking because it indicated as the newer Carwen house built in 1761 on the site of the old, a dilapidated building still standing in Olney Court, and well known to Ward in his antiquarian rambles over Stamper's Hill. The place was indeed only a few squares from his own home on a great hill's higher ground, and was now the abode of a Negro family much esteemed for occasional washing, house cleaning, and furnace tending services. To find in distant Salem such sudden proof of the significance of this familiar rookery in his own family history was a highly impressive thing to Ward, and he resolved to explore the place immediately upon his return. The more mystical phases of the letter, which he took to be some extravagant kind of symbolism, frankly baffled him, though he noted with a thrill of curiosity that the biblical passage referred to Job 14:14 was the familiar verse, "If a man die, shall he live again? All the days of my appointed time will I wait, till my change come." 2. Young Ward came home in a state of pleasant excitement, and spent the following Saturday in a long and exhaustive study of the house in Olney Court. The place, now crumbling with age, had never been a mansion, but was a modest 2.5-story wooden townhouse of the familiar Providence colonial type, with plain peaked roof, large central chimney, and artistically carved doorway with rayed fanlight, triangular pediment, and trim Doric pilasters. It had suffered but little alternation externally, and Ward felt he was gazing on something very close to the sinister matters of his quest. The present Negro inhabitants were known to him, and he was very courteously shown about the interior by old Asa and his stout wife Hannah. Here there was more change than the outside indicated, and Ward saw with regret that fully half of the fine scroll and iron overmantels and shell-carved cupboard linings were gone, whilst much of the fine wainscoting and collection moulding was marked, hacked and gouged, or covered altogether with cheap wallpaper. In general, the survey did not yield as much as Ward had somehow expected, but it was at least exciting to stand within the ancestral walls which had housed such a man of horror as Joseph Cohen. He saw with a thrill that a monogram had been very carefully effaced from the ancient brass knocker. From then until after the close of school, Ward spent his time on the photostatic copy of the Hutchinson cipher and the accumulation of local Cohen data. The former still proved unyielding, but of the latter he obtained so much and so many clues to similar data elsewhere that he was ready by July to make a trip to New London and New York to consult old letters whose presence in those places was indicated. This trip was very fruitful, for it brought him the Fenner letters with their terrible description of the Pawtuxet farmhouse raid, and the Nightingale Talbot letters, in which he learned of the portrait painted on a panel of the Carwen library. This matter of the portrait interested him particularly, since he would have given much to know just what Joseph Carwen looked like, and he decided to make a second search of the house in Olney Court to see if there might not be some trace of the ancient features beneath peeling coats of later paint or layers of moldy wallpaper. Early in August that search took place, and Ward went carefully over the walls of every room sizable enough to have been, by any possibility, the library of the evil builder. He paid especial attention to the large panels of such overmantels as still remained, and was keenly excited, after about an hour, when on a broad area above the fireplace in a spacious ground floor room he became certain that the surface brought out by the peeling of several coats of paint was sensibly darker than any ordinary interior paint or the wood beneath it was likely to have been. A few more careful tests with a thin knife, and he knew that he had come upon an oil portrait of great extent. With truly scholarly restraint, the youth did not risk the damage which an immediate attempt to uncover the hidden picture with the knife might have done, but just retired from the scene of his discovery to enlist expert help. In 3 days, he returned with an artist of long experience, Mr. Walter C. Dwight, whose studio is near the foot of College Hill, and that accomplished restorer of paintings set to work at once with proper methods and chemical substances. Oldesa and his wife were duly excited over their strange visitors, and were properly reimbursed for this invasion of their domestic hearth. As day by day the work of restoration progressed, Charles Ward looked on with a growing interest at the lines and shades gradually unveiled after their long oblivion. Dwight had begun at the bottom, hence since the picture was a 3/4 length one, the face did not come out for some time. It was meanwhile seen that the subject was a spare, well-shaped man with dark blue coat, embroidered waistcoat, black satin small clothes, and white silk stockings, seated in a carved chair against the background of a window with wharves and ships beyond. When the head came out, it was observed to bear a neat albemarle wig, and to possess a thin, calm, undistinguished face which seemed somehow familiar to both Ward and the artist. Only at the very last, though, did the restorer and his client begin to gasp with astonishment at the details of that lean, pallid visage, and to recognize with a touch of awe the dramatic trick which heredity had played. For it took the final bath of oil and the final stroke of a delicate scraper to bring out fully the expression which centuries had hidden, and to confront the bewildered Charles Dexter Ward, dweller in the past, with his own living features, in the countenance of his horrible great-great-great-grandfather. Ward brought his parents to see the marvel he had uncovered, and his father at once determined to purchase the picture despite its execution on stationary paneling. The resemblance to the boy, despite an appearance of rather greater age, was marvelous, and it could be seen that through some trick of atavism, the physical contours of Joseph Cohen had found precise duplication after a century and a half. Mrs. Ward's resemblance to her ancestor was not at all marked, though she could recall relatives who had some of the facial characteristics shared by her son and by the bygone Cohen. She did not relish the discovery and told her husband that he had better burn the picture instead of bringing it home. There was, she averred, something unwholesome about it, not only intrinsically, but in its very resemblance to Charles. Mr. Ward, however, was a practical man of power and affairs, a cotton manufacturer with extensive mills at River Point in Pawtuxet Valley, and not one to listen to feminine scruples. The picture impressed him mightily with its likeness to his son, and he believed the boy deserved it as a present. In this opinion, it is needless to say, Charles most heartily concurred, and a few days later, Mr. Ward located the owner of the house, a small rodent-featured person with a guttural accent, and obtained the whole mantle and overmantle, bearing the picture at a curtly fixed price, which cut short the impending torrent of unctuous haggling. It now remained to take off the panelling and remove it to the Ward home, where provisions were made for its thorough restoration and installation with an electric mock fireplace in Charles's third-floor study or library. To Charles was left the task of superintending this removal, and on the 28th of August, he accompanied two expert workmen from the Crooker decorating firm to the house in Olney Court, where the mantle and portrait-bearing overmantle were detached with great care and precision for transportation in the company's motor truck. There was left a space of exposed brickwork marking the chimney's course, and in this young Ward observed a cubical recess about a foot square, which must have lain directly behind the head of the portrait. Curious as to what such a space might mean or contain, the youth approached and looked within, finding beneath the deep coatings of dust and soot some loose yellowed papers, a crude, thick copybook, and a few mouldering textile shreds, which may have formed the ribbon binding the rest together. Blowing away the bulk of the dirt and cinders, he took up the book and looked at the bold inscription on its cover. It was in the hand which he had learned to recognize at the Essex Institute, and proclaimed the volume as Journal and Notes of Jos. Cohen, Gentleman of Providence Plantations, late of Salem. Excited beyond measure by his discovery, Ward showed the book to the two curious workmen beside him. Their testimony is absolute as to the nature and genuineness of the finding, and Dr. Willett relies on them to help establish his theory that the youth was not mad when he began his major eccentricities. All the other papers were likewise in Cohen's handwriting, and one of them seemed especially portentous because of its inscription: "To him who shall come after, and how he may get beyond time and his fears." Another was in a cipher, the same, Ward hoped, as the Hutchinson cipher, which had hitherto baffled him. A third, and here the searcher rejoiced, seemed to be a key to the cipher, whilst the fourth and fifth were addressed respectively to Edu Hutchinson, Arminger, and Jedediah Orne, Esquire, or their heirs or heir, or those representing them. The sixth and last was inscribed: Joseph Cohen, his life and travels beneath 1678 and 1687. Of whither he voyaged, where he stayed, whom he saw, and what he learned. 3. We have now reached the point from which the more academic school of alienists date Charles Ward's madness. Upon his discovery, the youth had looked immediately at the few of the inner pages of the book and the manuscripts, and had evidently seen something which impressed him tremendously. Indeed, in shewing the titles to the workmen, he appeared to guard the text itself with peculiar care, and to labor under a perturbation for which even the antiquarian and genealogical significance of the find could hardly account. Upon returning home, he broke the news with an almost embarrassed air, as if he wished to convey an idea of its supreme importance without having to exhibit the evidence itself. He did not even shew the titles to his parents, but simply told them that he had found some documents in Joseph Cohen's handwriting, mostly in cipher, which would have to be studied very carefully before yielding up their true meaning. It is unlikely that he would have shewn what he did to the workmen, had it not been for an unconcealed curiosity. As it was, he doubtless wished to avoid any display of peculiar reticence which would increase their discussion of the matter. That night, Charles Ward sat up in his room, reading the new-found book and papers, and when they came he did not desist. His meals, on his urgent request when his mother called to see what was amiss, were sent up to him, and in the afternoon he appeared only briefly when the men came to install the Cohen picture and mantelpiece in his study. The next night he slept in snatches in his clothes, meanwhile wrestling feverishly with the unravelling of the cipher manuscript. In the morning his mother saw that he was at work on the photostatic copy of the Hutchinson cipher, which he had frequently shown her before. But in response to her query, he said that the Cohen key could not be applied to it. That afternoon, he abandoned his work and watched the men fascinatedly as they finished their installation of the picture with its woodwork above the cleverly realistic electric log, setting the mock fireplace and overmantel a little out from the north wall as if the chimney existed, and boxing in the sides with paneling to match the rooms. The front panel holding the picture was sewn and hinged to allow cupboard space behind it. After the workman went, he moved his work into the study and sat down before it with his eyes half on the cipher and half on the portrait, which stared back at him like a year-adding and century-recalling mirror. His parents, subsequently recalling his conduct at this period, give interesting details anent the policy of concealment which he practiced. Before servants, he seldom hid any paper which he might be studying, since he rightly assumed that Cohen's intricate and archaic chirography would be too much for them. With his parents, however, he was more circumspect, and unless the manuscript in question were a cipher, or a mere mass of cryptic symbols and unknown ideographs, as that entitled "To him who shall come after," etc., seemed to be, he would cover it with some convenient paper until his caller had departed. At night, he kept the papers under lock and key in an antique cabinet of his, where he also placed them whenever he left the room. He soon resumed fairly regular hours and habits, except that his long walks and other outside interests seemed to cease. The opening of school, where he now began his senior year, seemed a great bore to him, and he frequently asserted his determination never to bother with college. He had, he said, important special investigations to make, which would provide him with more avenues toward knowledge and the humanities than any university which the world could boast. Naturally, only one who had always been more or less studious, eccentric and solitary could have pursued this course for many days without attracting notice. Ward, however, was constitutionally a scholar and a hermit, hence his parents were less surprised than regretful at the close confinement and secrecy he adopted. At the same time, both his father and mother thought it odd that he would shew them no scrap of his treasure trove, nor give any connected account of such data as he had deciphered. This reticence he explained away as due to a wish to wait until he might announce some connected revelation, but as the weeks passed without further disclosures, there began to grow up between the youth and his family a kind of constraint, intensified in his mother's case by her manifest disapproval of all Cohen delvings. During October, Ward began visiting the libraries again, but no longer for the antiquarian matter of his former days. Witchcraft and magic, occultism and demonology were what he sought now, and when Providence sources proved unfruitful, he would take the train for Boston and tap the wealth of the great library in Copley Square, the Widener Library at Harvard, or the Zion Research Library in Brookline, where certain rare books on biblical subjects are available. He bought extensively and fitted up a whole additional set of shelves in his study for newly acquired works on uncanny subjects, while during the Christmas holidays he made a round of out-of-town trips, including one to Salem to consult certain records at the Essex Institute. About the middle of January 1920, there entered Ward's bearing an element of triumph which he did not explain, and he was no more found at work upon the Hutchinson cipher. Instead, he inaugurated a dual policy of chemical research and record scanning, fitting up for the one a laboratory in the unused attic of the house, and for the latter haunting all the sources of vital statistics in Providence. Local dealers in drugs and scientific supplies, later questioned, gave astonishingly queer and meaningless catalogues of the substances and instruments he purchased. But clerks at the State House, the City Hall, and the various libraries agree as to the definite object of his second interest. He was searching intensely and feverishly for the grave of Joseph Cohen, from whose slate slab an older generation had so wisely blotted the name. Little by little there grew upon the Ward family the conviction that something was wrong. Charles had had freaks and changes of minor interests before, but this growing secrecy and absorption in strange pursuits was unlike even him. His schoolwork was the merest pretense, and although he failed in no test, it could be seen that the old application had all vanished. He had other concernments now, and when not in his new laboratory with a score of obsolete alchemical books, could be found either poring over old burial records downtown or glued to his volumes of occult law in his study, where the startlingly, one almost fancied increasingly similar features of Joseph Cohen stared blandly at him from the great overmantel on the north wall. Late in March, Ward added to his archive searching a ghoulish series of rambles about the various ancient cemeteries of the city. The cause appeared later, when it was learned from City Hall clerks that he had probably found an important clue. His quest had suddenly shifted from the grave of Joseph Cohen to that of one Naphtali Field, and this shift was explained when, upon going over the files that he had been over, the investigators actually found a fragmentary record of Cohen's burial, which had escaped the general obliteration, and which stated that the curious leaden coffin had been interred 10 feet south and 5 feet west of Naphtali Field's grave in Yee. The lack of a specified burying ground in the surviving entry greatly complicated the search, and Naphtali Field's grave seemed as elusive as that of Cohen. But here no systematic effacement had existed, and one might reasonably be expected to stumble on the stone itself, even if its record had perished. Hence the rambles, from which St. John's, the former King's, churchyard and the ancient congregational burying ground in the midst of Swan Point Cemetery were excluded, since other statistics had shown that the only Naphtali Field, Ovid 1729, whose grave could have been meant, had been a Baptist. 4. It was toward May when Dr. Willett, at the request of the senior ward, and fortified with all the Cohen data which the family had gleaned from Charles in his non-secretive days, talked with the young man. The interview was of little value or conclusiveness, for Willett felt at every moment that Charles was thoroughly master of himself and in touch with matters of real importance, but it at least forced the secretive youth to offer some rational explanation of his recent demeanor. Of a pallid, impassive type not easily shewing embarrassment, Ward seemed quite ready to discuss his pursuits, though not to reveal their object. He stated that the papers of his ancestor had contained some remarkable secrets of early scientific knowledge, for the most part in cipher, of an apparent scope comparable only to the discoveries of Friar Bacon, and perhaps surpassing even those. They were, however, meaningless except when correlated with a body of learning now wholly obsolete, so that their immediate presentation to a world equipped only with modern science would rob them of all impressiveness and dramatic significance. To take their vivid place in the history of human thought, they must first be correlated by one familiar with the background out of which they evolved, and to this task of correlation Ward was now devoting himself. He was seeking to acquire as fast as possible those neglected arts of old which a true interpreter of the Cohen data must possess, and hoped in time to make a full announcement and presentation of the utmost interest to mankind and to the world of thought. Not even Einstein, he declared, could more profoundly revolutionize the current conception of things. As to his graveyard research, whose object he freely admitted, but the details of whose progress he did not relate, he said he had reason to think that Joseph Carwen's mutilated headstone bore certain mystic symbols, carved from directions in his will, and ignorantly spurred by those who had effaced the name, which were absolutely essential to the final solution of his cryptic system. Cohen, he believed, had wished to guard his secret with care, and had consequently distributed the data in an exceedingly curious fashion. When Dr. Willett asked to see the mystic documents, Ward displayed much reluctance and tried to put him off with such things as photostatic copies of the Hutchinson cipher and own formulae and diagrams, but finally showed him the exteriors of some of the real Cohen finds, the journal and notes, the cipher, title and cipher also, and the formula-filled message to him who shall come after, and let him glance inside such as were in obscure characters. He also opened the diary at a page carefully selected for its innocuousness, and gave Willett a glimpse of Cohen's connected handwriting in English. The doctor noted very closely the crabbed and complicated letters, and the general aura of the 17th century which clung round both penmanship and style, despite the writer's survival into the 18th century, and became quickly certain that the document was genuine. The text itself was relatively trivial, and Willett recalled only a fragment. Wednesday 16, October 1754. My sloop, the Wakeful, this day put in from London with XX Newry men picked up in the Indies, Spaniards from Martinico, and 2 Dutchmen from Suriname. Ye Dutchmen are like to desert from having heard ye somewhat ill of those ventures, but I will see to ye inducing of them to stay. For Mr. Knight Dexter of ye buoyant book, 120 pieces camlets, 100 pieces assorted Campbelltines, 20 pieces blue duffels, 100 pieces shallows, 50 pieces calamancos, 300 pieces each, shensoy and hummus, for Miss Green at ye Elephant, 50 gallon siddles, 20 warmed pans, 15 bake siddles, 10 prepared smoked tongues, for Miss Perigo 1 set of awls, for Miss Nightingale 50 reams prime foolscape. Said ye sabothed fries last nighty, but none appeared. I must hear ye more from Mr. H. in Pennsylvania, though it is hardy reaching him, and exceeding strange he cannot give me the use of what he hath so well used these 100 years. Simon hath not writ these weeks, but I expect ye soon hearing from him. When upon reaching this point, Dr. Willett turned a leaf, he was quickly checked by Ward, who almost snatched the book from his grasp. All that the doctor had a chance to see on the newly opened page was a brief pair of sentences, but these, strangely enough, lingered tenaciously in his memory. They ran, Ye verse from liber damnatus, being spoked vi rude masses and 4 Hallows Eves. I am hopeful ye thing is breeding outside ye spheres. It will draw ye one who is to come, if I can make sure he shall be, and he shall think on past thingies and look back through all ye years, against ye which I must have ready souls, or that to make 'em with. Willett saw no more, but somehow the small glimpse gave a new and vague terror to the painted features of Joseph Cohen, which stared blandly down from the overmantel. even after that he entertained the odd fancy, which his medical skill of course assured him was only a fancy, that the eyes of the portrait had a sort of wish, if not an actual tendency, to follow young Charles Ward as he moved about the room. He stopped before leaving to study the picture closely, marveling at its resemblance to Charles, and memorizing every minute detail of the cryptical colorless face, even down to a slight scar or pit in the smooth brow above the right eye. Cosmo Alexander, he decided, was a painter worthy of the Scotland who had produced Rebun, and a teacher worthy of his illustrious pupil Gilbert Strode. Assured by the doctor that Charles's mental health was in no danger, but that on the other hand he was engaged in researches which might prove of real importance, the Wards were more lenitent than they might otherwise have been when during the following June the youth made positive his refusal to attend college. He had, he declared, studies of much more vital importance to pursue, and intimated a wish to go abroad the following year in order to avail himself of certain sources of data not existing in America. The senior Ward, while denying this latter wish as absurd for a boy of only 18, acquiesced regarding the university, so that after a none too brilliant graduation from the Moses Brown School, there ensued for Charles a 3-year period of intensive occult study and graveyard searching. He became recognized as an eccentric, and dropped even more completely from the sight of his family's friends than he had been before, keeping close to his work and only occasionally making trips to other cities to consult obscure records. Once he went south to talk with a strange old mulatto who dwelt in a swamp and about whom a newspaper had printed a curious article. Again he sought a small village in the Adirondacks, whence reports of certain odd ceremonial practices had come. But still his parents forbade him the trip to the old world which he desired. Coming of age in April 1923, and having previously inherited a small competence from his maternal grandfather, Ward determined at last to take the European trip he had to denied him. Of his proposed itinerary he would say nothing save that the needs of his studies would carry him to many places, but he promised to write his parents fully and faithfully. When they saw he could not be dissuaded, they ceased all opposition and helped as best as they could, so that in June the young man sailed for Liverpool with the farewell blessings of his father and mother, who accompanied him to Boston and waved him out of the sight from the White Star Pier in Charlestown. Letters soon told of his safe arrival, and of his securing good quarters in Great Russell Street, London, wherein he proposed to stay, shunning all family friends, till he had exhausted the resources of the British Museum in a certain direction. Of his daily life he wrote but little, for there was little to write. Study and experiment consumed all his time, and he mentioned a laboratory which he had established in one of his rooms. That he said nothing of antiquarian rambles in the glamorous old city with its luring skyline of ancient domes and steeples, and its tangles of roads and alleys, whose mystic convolutions and sudden vistas alternately beckon and surprise, was taken by his parents as a good index of the degree to which his new interests had engrossed his mind. In June 1924, a brief note told of his departure for Paris, to which he had before made 1 or 2 flying trips for material in the Bibliothèque Nationale. For 3 months thereafter, he sent only postal cards, giving an address in the Rue Saint-Jacques and referring to a special search among rare manuscripts in the library of an unnamed private collector. He avoided acquaintances, and no tourists brought back reports of having seen him. Then came a silence, and in October the Wards received a picture card from Prague, Czechoslovakia, stating that Charles was in the ancient town for the purpose of conferring with a certain very aged man, supposed to be the last living possessor of some very curious medieval information. He gave an address in the Neustadt and announced no move till the following January, when he dropped several cards from Vienna telling of his passage through the city on the way toward a more easterly region whither one of his correspondents and fellow delvers into the occult had invited him. The next card was from Klausenberg in Transylvania and told of Ward's progress toward his destination. He was going to visit a Baron Ferenczi, whose estate lay in the mountains east of Racus, and was to be addressed at Racus in the care of that nobleman. Another card from Racus a week later, saying that his host's carriage had met him and that he was leaving the village for the mountains, was his last message for a considerable time. Indeed, he did not reply to his parents' frequent letters until May, when he wrote to discourage the plan of his mother for a meeting in London, Paris, or Rome during the summer, when the elder Wards were planning to travel in Europe. His researches, he said, were such that he could not leave his present quarters, while the situation of Baron Ferenczi's castle did not favour visits. It was on a crag in the dark wooded mountains, and the region was so shunned by the country folk that normal people could not help feeling ill at ease. Moreover, the Baron was not a person likely to appeal to correct and conservative New England gentlefolk. His aspect and manners had idiosyncrasies, and his age was so great as to be disquieting. It would be better, Charles said, if his parents would wait for his return to Providence, which could scarcely be far distant. The return did not, however, take place until May 1926, when after a few heralding cards the young wanderer quietly slipped into New York on the Homeric and traversed the long miles to Providence by motor coach, eagerly drinking in the green rolling hills, the fragrant blossoming orchards, and the white steepled towns of Vernal, Connecticut, his first taste of ancient New England in nearly 4 years. When the coach crossed the Pawcatuck and entered Rhode Island amidst the fairy goldness of a late spring afternoon, his heart beat with quickened force, and the entry to Providence along Reservoir and Elmwood avenues was a breathless and wonderful thing despite the depths of forbidden lore to which he had delved. At the high square where Broad, Weybosset, and Empire streets join, he saw before and below him in the sphere of the sunset the pleasant, remembered houses and domes and steeples of the old town. And his head swam curiously as the vehicle rolled down to the terminal behind the Biltmore, bringing into view the great dome and soft roof-pieced greenery of the ancient hill across the river, and the tall colonial spire of the First Baptist Church limned pink in the magic evening light against the fresh springtime verdure of its precipitous background. Old Providence. It was this place, and the mysterious forces of its long, continuous history, which had brought him into being, and which had drawn him back toward marvels and secrets whose boundaries no prophet might mix. Here lay the arcana, wondrous or dreadful as the case might be, for which all his years of travel and application had been preparing him. A taxicab whirled him through the Post Office Square, with its glimpse of the river, the old market house, and the head of the bay, and up the steep curved slope of Waterman Street to Prospect, where the vast gleaming dome and sunset-flushed Ionic columns of the Christian Science Church beckoned northward. Then 8 squares past the fine old estates his childish eyes had known, and the quaint brick sidewalks so often trodden by his youthful feet. And at last the little white overtaken farmhouse on the right, on the left the classic Adam porch and stately bay facade of the great brick house where he was born. It was twilight, and Charles Dexter Ward had come home. 5. A school of alienists, slightly less academic than Dr. Limas, assigned to Ward's European trip the beginning of his true madness. Admitting that he was sane when he started, they believe that his conduct upon returning implies a disastrous change. But even to this claim, Dr. Willett refuses to accede. There was, he insists, something later, and the queernesses of the youth at this stage he attributes to the practice of rituals learned abroad. Odd enough things, to be sure, but by no means implying mental aberration on the part of their celebrant. Ward himself, though visibly aged and hardened, was still normal in his general reactions, and in several talks with Willett displayed a balance which no madman, even an incipient one, could feign continuously for long. What elicited the notion of insanity at this period were the sounds heard at all hours from Ward's attic laboratory, in which he kept himself most of the time. There were chantings and repetitions, and thunderous declamations in uncanny rhythms, and although these sounds were always in Ward's own voice, there was something in the quality of that voice, and in the accents of the formulae it pronounced, which could not but chill the blood of every hearer. It was noticed that Nig, the venerable and beloved black cat of the household, bristled and arched his back perceptibly when certain of the tones were heard. The odors occasionally wafted from the laboratory were likewise exceedingly strange. Sometimes they were very noxious, but more often they were aromatic, with a haunting, elusive quality which seemed to have the power of inducing fantastic images. People who smelled them had a tendency to glimpse momentary mirages of enormous vistas, with strange hills or endless avenues of sphinxes and hippogriffs stretching off into infinite distance. Ward did not resume his old-time rambles, but applied himself diligently to the strange books he had brought home, and to equally strange delvings within his quarters, explaining that European sources had greatly enlarged the possibilities of his work, and promising great revelations in the years to come. His older aspect increased to a startling degree his resemblance to the Cohen portrait in his library, and Dr. Willett would often pose by the latter after a call, marveling at the virtual identity, and reflecting that only the small pit above the picture's right eye now remained to differentiate the long-dead wizard from the living youth. These calls of Willett's, undertaken at the request of the senior wards, were curious affairs. The ward at no time repulsed the doctor, but the latter saw that he could never reach the young man's inner psychology. Frequently he noted peculiar things about little wax images of grotesque design on the shelves or tables, and the half-erased remnants of circles, triangles, and pentagrams in the chalk or charcoal on the cleared central space of the large room. And always in the night those rhythms and incantations thundered, till it became very difficult to keep servants or suppress furtive talk of Charles's madness. In January 1927, a peculiar incident occurred. One night about midnight, as Charles was chanting a ritual whose weird cadence echoed unpleasantly through the house below, there came a sudden gust of chill wind from the bay, and a faint, obscure trembling of the earth which everyone in the neighborhood noted. At the same time the cat exhibited phenomenal traces of fright, while dogs bayed for as much as a mile around. This was the prelude to a sharp thunderstorm, anomalous for the season, which brought with it such a crash that Mr. and Mrs. Ward believed the house had been struck. They rushed upstairs to see what damage had been done, but Charles met them at the door to the attic, pale, resolute, and portentous, with an almost fearsome combination of triumph and seriousness on his face. He assured them that the house had not really been struck, and that the storm would soon be over. They paused, and looking through a window saw that he was indeed right, for the lightning flashed farther and farther off, whilst the trees ceased to bend in the strange frigid gust from the water. The thunder sank to a sort of dull mumbling chuckle, and finally died away, Stars came out, and the stamp of triumph on Charles Ward's face crystallized into a very singular expression. For 2 months or more after this incident, Ward was less confined than usual to his laboratory. He exhibited a curious interest in the weather and made odd inquiries about the date of the spring thawing of the ground. One night late in March, he left the house after midnight and did not return till almost morning, when his mother, being wakeful, heard a rumbling motor draw up to the carriage entrance. Muffled oaths could be distinguished, and Mrs. Ward, rising and going to the window, saw 4 dark figures removing a long heavy box from a truck at Charles's direction and carrying it within by the side door. She heard labored breathing and ponderous footfalls on the stairs, and finally a dull thumping in the attic, after which the footfalls descended again, and the 4 men reappeared outside and drove off in their truck. The next day, Charles resumed his strict attic seclusion, drawing down the dark shades of his laboratory windows and appearing to be working on some metal substance. He would open the door to no one, and steadfastly refused all proffered food. About noon, a wrenching sound, followed by a terrible cry and a fall, were heard. But when Mrs. Ward rapped at the door, her son at length answered faintly, and told her that nothing had gone amiss. The hideous and indescribable stench now welling out was absolutely harmless and unfortunately necessary. Solitude was the one prime essential, and he would appear later for dinner. That afternoon, after the conclusion of some odd hissing sounds which came from behind the locked portal, he did finally appear, wearing an extremely haggard aspect and forbidding anyone to enter the laboratory upon any pretext. This indeed proved the beginning of a new policy of secrecy, for never afterward was any other person permitted to visit either the mysterious garret workroom or the adjacent storeroom, which he cleaned out, furnished roughly, and added to his inviolably private domain as a sleeping apartment. Here he lived, with books brought up from his library beneath, till the time he purchased the Pawtuxet bungalow and moved to it all his scientific effects. In the evening, Charles secured the paper before the rest of the family and damaged part of it through an apparent accident. Later, Dr. Willett, having fixed the date from statements of various members of the household, looked up an intact copy of the journal office and found that in the destroyed section the following small item had occurred. Nocturnal diggers surprised in North Burial Ground. Robert Hart, night watchman at the North Burial Ground, this morning discovered a party of several men with a motor truck in the oldest part of the cemetery, but apparently frightened them off before they had accomplished whatever their object may have been. The discovery took place at about 4 o'clock, when Hart's attention was attracted by the sound of a motor outside his shelter. Investigating, he saw a large truck on the main drive several rods away, but could not reach it before the sound of his feet on the gravel had revealed his approach. The man hastily placed a large box in the truck and drove away toward the street before they could be overtaken, and since no known grave was disturbed, Hart believes that this box was an object which they wished to bury. The diggers must have been at work for a long while before detection, for Hart found an enormous hole dug at a considerable distance back from the roadway in the lot of Amasa Field, where most of the old stones have long ago disappeared. The hole, a place as large and deep as a grave, was empty, and did not coincide with any interment mentioned in the cemetery records. Sergeant Riley of the 2nd Station viewed the spot and gave the opinion that the hole was dug by bootleggers rather gruesomely and ingeniously seeking a safe cache for liquor in a place not likely to be disturbed. In reply to questions, Hart said he thought the escaping truck had headed up the Rochambeau Avenue, though he could not be sure. During the next few days, Ward was seldom seen by his family. Having added sleeping quarters to his attic realm, he kept closely to himself there, ordering food brought to the door and not taking it in until after the servant had gone away. The droning of monotonous formulae and the chanting of bizarre rhythms recurred at intervals, while at other times occasional listeners could detect the sound of tinkling glass, hissing chemicals, running water, or roaring gas flames. Odors of the most unplaceable quality, wholly unlike any before noted, hung at times around the door, and the air of tension observable in the young recluse whenever he did venture briefly forth was such as to excite the keenest speculation. Once he made a hasty trip to the anathenium for a book he required, and again he hired a messenger to fetch him a highly obscure volume from Boston. Suspense was written portentously over the whole situation, and both the family and Dr. Willett confessed themselves wholly at a loss what to do or think about it. 6. Then, on the 15th of April, a strange development occurred. While nothing appeared to grow different in kind, there was certainly a very terrible difference in degree, and Dr. Willett somehow attaches great significance to the changes. The day was Good Friday, a circumstance of which the servants made much, but which others quite naturally dismiss as an irrelevant coincidence. Late in the afternoon, young Ward began repeating a certain formula in a singularly loud voice, at the same time burning some substance so pungent that its fumes escaped over the entire house. The formula was so plainly audible in the hall outside the locked door that Mrs. Ward could not help memorizing it as she waited and listened anxiously, and later on she was able to write it down at Dr. Willett's request. It ran as follows, and experts have told Dr. Willett that its very close analogue can be found in the mystic writings of Eliphas Levi, that cryptic soul who crept through a crack in the forbidden door and glimpsed the frightful vistas of the void beyond. Per Adonai Elohim, Adonai Jehovah, Adonai Sabaoth, metraton on aglamaphon, verbum pythonicum, mysterium salamandrei, conventus silvorum, antragnomorum, daemonia coeligad, almusin gibor Jehosa, ivam, zariadnantmic, veni, veni, veni. This had been going on for 2 hours without change or intermission when over all the neighborhood a pandemoniac howling of dogs set in. The extent of this howling can be judged from the space it received in the papers the next day, but to those in the Ward household it was overshadowed by the odor which instantly followed it. A hideous, all-pervasive odor which none of them had ever smelled before or have ever smelled since. In the midst of this mephitic flood there came a very perceptible flash like that of lightning, which would have been blinding and impressive but for the daylight around, and then was heard the voice that no listener can ever forget because of its thunderous remoteness, its incredible depth, and its eldritch dissimilarity to Charles Ward's voice. It shook the house, and was clearly heard by at least 2 neighbors above the howling of the dogs. Mrs. Ward, who had been listening in despair outside her son's locked laboratory, shivered as she recognized its hellish import, for Charles had told her of its evil fame in dark books, and of the manner in which it had thundered, according to the Fenner letters, above the doomed Pawtuxet farmhouse on the night of Joseph Carwen's annihilation. There was no mistaking that nightmare phrase, for Charles had described it too vividly in the old days when he had talked frankly of his Cohen investigations. And yet, it was only this fragment of an archaic and forgotten language. Dies mies jescet boene doesef dovema eniteamus. Close upon this thundering there came a momentary darkening of the daylight, though sunset was still an hour distant, and then a puff of added odor different from the first, but equally unknown and intolerable. Charles was chanting again now, and his mother could hear syllables that sounded like I nash yok sotov, he igeb feet hodog, ending in a ya, whose maniacal force mounted in an ear-splitting crescendo. A second later, all previous memories were effaced by the wailing scream which burst out with frantic explosiveness and gradually changed form to a paroxysm of diabolic and hysterical laughter. Mrs. Ward, with a mingled fear and blind courage of maternity, advanced and knocked affrightedly at the concealing panels, but obtained no sign of recognition. She knocked again, but paused nervously as the second shriek arose, this one unmistakably in the familiar voice of her son, and sounding concurrently with the still bursting cachinnations of that other voice. Presently she fainted, although she is still unable to recall the precise and immediate cause. Memory sometimes makes merciful deletions. Mr. Ward returned from the business section at about 6:15, and not finding his wife downstairs, was told by the frightened servants that she was probably watching at Charles's door, from which the sounds had been far stranger than ever before. Mounting the stairs at once, he saw Mrs. Ward stretched at full length on the floor of the corridor outside the laboratory, and, realizing that she had fainted, hastened to fetch a glass of water from a set bowl in a neighboring alcove. Dashing the cold fluid in her face, he was heartened to observe an immediate response on her part, and was watching the bewildered opening of her eyes when a chill shot through him and threatened to reduce him to the very state from which she was emerging. For the seemingly silent laboratory was not as silent as it had appeared to be, but held the murmurs of a tense, muffled conversation in tones too low for comprehension, yet of a quality profoundly disturbing to the soul. It was not, of course, new for Charles to mutter formulae, but this muttering was definitely different. It was so palpably a dialogue, or imitation of a dialogue, with the regular alternation of inflections suggesting question and answer, statement and response. One voice was undisguisedly that of Charles, but the other had a depth and hollowness which the youth's best powers of ceremonial mimicry had scarcely approached before. There was something hideous, blasphemous, and abnormal about it, and but for a cry from his recovering wife, which cleared his mind by arousing his protective instincts, it is not likely that Theodore Holland Ward could have maintained for nearly a year more his old boast that he had never fainted. As it was, he seized his wife in his arms and bore her quickly downstairs before she could notice the voices which had so horribly disturbed him. Even so, however, he was not quick enough to escape catching something himself, which caused him to stagger dangerously with his burden. For Mrs. Ward's cry had evidently been heard by others than he, and there had come from behind the locked door the first distinguishable words which that masked and terrible colloquy had yielded. They were merely an excited caution in Charles's own voice, but somehow their implications held a nameless fright for the father who overheard them. The phrase was just this: "Shh! Right!" Mr. and Mrs. Ward conferred at some length after dinner, and the former resolved to have a firm and serious talk with Charles that very night. No matter how important the object, such conduct could no longer be permitted, for these latest developments transcended every limit of sanity and formed a menace to the order and nervous well-being of the entire household. The youth must indeed have taken complete leave of his senses, since only downright madness could have prompted the wild screams and imaginary conversations in assumed voices which the present day had brought forth. All this must be stopped, or Mrs. Ward would be made ill, and the keeping of servants became an impossibility. Mr. Ward rose at the close of the meal and started upstairs for Charles's laboratory. On the third floor, however, he paused at the sounds which he heard proceeding from the now disused library of his son. Books were apparently being flung about and papers wildly rustled, and upon stepping to the door, Mr. Ward beheld the youth within, excitedly assembling a vast armful of literary matter of every size and shape. Charles's aspect was very drawn and haggard, and he dropped his entire load with a start at the sound of his father's voice. At the elder man's command he sat down, and for some time listened to the admonitions he had so long deserved. There was no scene. At the end of the lecture he agreed that his father was right, and that his noises, mutterings, incantations, and chemical odors were indeed inexcusable nuisances. He agreed to a policy of greater quiet, though insisting on a prolongation of his extreme privacy. Much of his future work, he said, was in any case purely book research, and he could obtain quarters elsewhere for any such vocal rituals as might be necessary at a later stage. For the fright and fainting of his mother, he expressed the keenest contrition, and explained that the conversation later heard was part of an elaborate symbolism designed to create a certain mental atmosphere. His use of abstruse technical terms somewhat bewildered Mr. Ward, but the parting impression was one of undeniable sanity and poise despite a mysterious tension of the utmost gravity. The interview was really quite inconclusive, and as Charles picked up his armful and left the room, Mr. Ward hardly knew what to make of the entire business. It was as mysterious as the death of poor old Nig, whose stiffening form had been found an hour before in the basement, with staring eyes and fear-distorted mouth. Driven by some vague detective instinct, the bewildered parent now glanced curiously at the vacant shelves to see what his son had taken up to the attic. The youth's library was plainly and rigidly classified, so that one might tell at a glance the books, or at least the kind of books, which had been withdrawn. On this occasion Mr. Ward was astonished to find that nothing of the occult or the antiquarian, beyond what had been previously removed, was missing. These new withdrawals were all modern items: histories, scientific treatises, geographies, manuals of literature, philosophic works, and certain contemporary newspapers and magazines. It was a very curious shift from Charles Ward's recent run of reading, and the father paused in a growing vortex of perplexity and an engulfing sense of strangeness. The strangeness was a very poignant sensation, and almost clawed at his chest as he strove to see just what was wrong around him. Something was indeed wrong, and tangibly as well as spiritually so. Ever since he had been in this room, he had known that something was amiss, and at last it dawned upon him what it was. On the north wall rose still the ancient carved overmantel from the house in Olney Court, but to the cracked and precariously restored oils of the large Cohen portrait disaster had come. Time and unequal heating had done the work at last, and at some time since the room's last cleaning, the worst had happened. Peeling clear of the wood, curling tighter and tighter, and finally crumbling to small bits, with what must have been malignly silent suddenness, the portrait of Joseph Cohen had resigned forever its starring surveillance of the youth it so strangely resembled, and now lay scattered on the floor as a thin coating of fine bluish-grey dust.